He didn't knock. Men like Dante Romano never knocked. The door to the Bennett farmhouse swung open before anyone could reach it, and three shadows filled the frame. Broad, quiet, and patient in the way that only men who've never been told no could be. Behind them, a fourth figure stepped through, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Dante Romano. 41 years old. 6 feet of composed, unhurried violence dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than the Bennett family's monthly harvest. His eyes moved across the room the way a surgeon's hands move across a body. Clinical, deliberate, already deciding what needed to come out. Isla Bennett saw him before he saw her. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands from washing the lunch plates, and in the half-second before he turned his gaze toward her, she had enough time to understand with absolute clarity what was about to happen to her family. Everything. If this story hits you somewhere real, if you feel that pull in your chest when everything a family has built is about to be taken, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because what Dante Romano does next is the last thing anyone in that room expected. The vineyard had been dying for 3 years before the debt came due. Isla could see it every morning from the window above the kitchen sink. The way the vines on the eastern slope had thinned, the way the trellises her grandfather built by hand now listed at odd angles that no one had gotten around to fixing. The Bennett land was 42 acres of what had once been the most productive small-batch winery in the Crestwood Valley, and now it was 42 acres of quiet, accumulated failure. Her father, Thomas Bennett, was a good man. Isla had spent 30 years being certain of that, and she still was. He was gentle in the way that farmers sometimes are, patient with weather, with soil, with the slow rhythms of things that couldn't be hurried. What he was not, and had never been, was good with money, or with men who wanted it back. She hadn't known about the debt until 6 weeks ago. That was when the first envelope arrived. Cream-colored, no-return address, the kind of envelope that doesn't need one because the person sending it already knows you won't throw it away. Inside was a single page, a number with too many zeros, a name at the bottom that made her father go white at the kitchen table and sit very still for a long time without speaking. Romano. Isla had heard the name before. Everyone in the valley had. The Romano family's reach extended from the waterfront operations in New Haven all the way west through Connecticut and into the soft borders of 3 neighboring states. They weren't a rumor. They weren't a myth. They were simply a fact of the region, the way weather was a fact, the way bad harvests were a fact. Something you didn't invite and couldn't stop and tried very hard never to owe anything to. Her father had, apparently, owed them $260,000 for the past 4 years. When she'd asked him, calmly she thought, though her hands were shaking, he hadn't been able to look at her. He talked about a bad year, then another bad year, then a loan that had seemed manageable at the time from a man he'd met through a mutual contact, a man who'd presented himself as a private investor with flexible terms. He hadn't known whose money it was. That was what he said. Isla had believed him because she needed to, and also because it didn't matter anymore. The name on the contract was the only name that counted now. The second envelope had arrived 2 weeks after the first. It contained no letter, just a date. Today's date. She'd spent the last 2 weeks trying every channel she could think of. A lawyer in Hartford who'd gone pale when she'd shown him the contract and handed it back without touching it again. A cousin who knew people and had come back with nothing but the advice to leave the state. A bank that had declined to meet with her at all once they'd run the property assessment. The vineyard wasn't worth enough to cover the debt. The house wasn't worth enough. Everything combined, liquidated, sold to the right buyer on the right day, still not enough. So she'd stayed. She'd made her father eat breakfast this morning, she'd washed the plates, and she'd been standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands when the door opened and Dante Romano walked into the room. He was not what she'd constructed in her head. She'd built him from second-hand accounts, and the particular quality of fear she'd heard in the lawyer's voice, and she'd expected something cruder. A man who wore his power loudly, who filled a room with noise. Instead, he was very quiet. He stood just inside the threshold and looked around the farmhouse the way someone looks at a property they're already deciding what to do with and he didn't rush it, and his men didn't move, and the silence stretched long enough that her father pushed back his chair at the kitchen table and stood up. "Mr. Romano." Thomas Bennett's voice was steady. Isla had always admired that about him. The steadiness that didn't mean he wasn't afraid, only that he'd decided the fear was private. "I want you to know I intend to—" "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Not unkind, not loud, just certain. The kind of voice that had stopped expecting to be argued with sometime in the distant past. Her father sat down. Romano walked to the center of the room. He didn't look at the furniture or the photographs on the wall or the faded curtains her mother had sewn 20 years ago. He looked at Thomas Bennett, and the examination was thorough and brief, and at the end of it something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not sympathy, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has identified a type. "You know why I'm here," Romano said. "Yes." "Then you know what I'm here to collect." Thomas Bennett's jaw tightened. You've been trying to arrange something for 4 years." Romano pulled out the chair across from her father and sat down without being invited, settling into it with the ease of a man who'd never in his life sat somewhere he wasn't welcome because the concept simply didn't apply to him. "The arrangement period is finished." Isla stepped out of the kitchen doorway. She hadn't planned it. Her body simply moved before her mind could produce an argument against it, and then she was standing in the middle of the room with the dish towel still in her hands, and 3 large men in dark jackets tracking her with their eyes, and Dante Romano turning slowly in his chair to look at her. "Isla." Her father's voice was sharp with something close to panic. "Go back inside." "No." She looked at Romano. Up close, he was older than she'd thought from across the room. Not old, but worn in particular places, around the eyes, along the jaw, the way men who've operated under sustained pressure wear over time. His face was angular and would have been handsome in a simpler life. His eyes were dark and currently very still, and focused entirely on her with an attention that felt almost physical. "I'm Thomas Bennett's daughter. Whatever you have to say to him, you can say in front of me." Romano studied her for a moment. "Is that so?" "Yes." He didn't tell her to sit down. He didn't tell her to leave. He simply looked at her for 3 or 4 seconds with that same clinical attention and then turned back to her father. "260,000, he said, plus 4 years of compounding interest, which brings the total to just under 400,000. I have the paperwork." He nodded once, and one of the men behind him produced a leather folder and set it on the table. "I also have a court judgment, executed last week, which gives me legal claim to this property. The acreage, the structures, the equipment, the inventory, everything." Thomas Bennett's face had gone the color of old ash. "The house is included in the structures, yes." The word "yes" landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Isla felt the floor shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. She'd known this was coming. She'd spent 6 weeks knowing this was coming and building herself up against it, telling herself she was prepared, and she understood now that prepared was a word that had never applied to this moment, that there was no preparation for watching the specific look on her father's face when the thing he'd spent his whole life building was taken from him with a single syllable. She said, "Name your terms." Both men looked at her. "There have to be terms," she said. Her voice was level. She was making it level through a conscious, sustained effort that was costing her something she could feel in her sternum. "You came here personally. A man in your position doesn't drive out to a failing vineyard in Crestwood Valley personally to collect on a debt this size. You send someone. You send several someones. You sent yourself, which means you want something specific." She looked at him steadily. "So tell me what it is." The quality of the silence changed. Romano looked at her for a long time, long enough that one of his men shifted his weight slightly, which seemed to be the closest anyone in that room ever came to expressing discomfort in his presence. Then something moved at the corner of Romano's mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite anything she had a word for. "You did your homework," he said. "I've had 6 weeks. What else did you find out?" "That you're 41 years old. That you've run the Romano organization since your father's death 8 years ago. and that under your management it has expanded into 4 additional states, that you have a reputation for precision, for not making moves that don't serve a purpose, that you have never personally collected on a debt this small. She paused. Which means the debt isn't why you're here. Romano leaned back in the chair and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. Smart, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an assessment. Tell me what you actually want, Isla said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, thicker than the one his man had laid on the table, a different color, the edges worn in a way that suggested it had been folded and unfolded multiple times. He set it on the table in front of her father, but kept his eyes on Isla. Read the top line, he said. Thomas Bennett leaned forward and looked at the document. The color that came into his face was not relief. It was something more complicated than relief, something with confusion threaded through it. He looked up at Romano. This is the deed to this property, Romano said, transferred to your name, clear title, no liens, no outstanding claims. The room was completely silent. And the debt? Isla asked. Romano reached into his jacket again and produced the original contract, the cream-colored pages with her father's signature at the bottom, and set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then he picked it up with both hands and tore it in half. The sound of it was very small in the quiet room. He set the 2 pieces on the table and looked at Isla, not at her father, and said, Marry me instead. The 3 seconds that followed were the strangest 3 seconds of Isla Bennett's life. She heard her father make a sound that wasn't a word. She heard one of Romano's men shift his weight again. She heard the clock on the mantel, the one that had belonged to her grandmother and kept slightly imperfect time, tick 3 times in the silence. Then she said, You're serious. I don't make jokes about contracts, Romano said. Marriage is not a contract you can tear up if the terms don't suit you. No, he agreed. It isn't. Then why? She stopped, restarted. Why me? You don't know me. You've been in this room for 10 minutes. I know enough. That's not an answer. No, he said again. It isn't. He stood up, which put him a full head taller than her, and she made herself hold her ground and keep her eyes on his because she understood that this was the kind of man who read everything in a person's body, and she couldn't afford to give him anything he could use. I'm not going to explain myself to you tonight. What I'm going to do is leave that deed on this table and give you until tomorrow morning to decide. If the answer is yes, I'll send a car at 8 o'clock. If no one gets in the car, I'll send different people. He glanced at her father. You understand what I mean by different people. Thomas Bennett understood. He didn't speak, but he understood. Romano picked up his jacket from where he'd draped it over the back of the chair and looked at Isla one more time. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice was different for a moment, quieter, stripped of the official weight. You handled this better than most men I've dealt with. I'm not interested in your opinion of how I handled it, Isla said. The corner of his mouth moved again. No, he said. I didn't think you would be. He walked out. His men followed. The door closed behind them with a soft, definitive click. Isla stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair Romano had just vacated and looked at the torn pieces of the contract on the table and the deed next to them and her father's face across from hers, which had aged a decade in the last 20 minutes. Isla, he started. Don't, she said. Not yet. She needed a minute. She needed to think clearly, and she could not think clearly if he started talking because she would hear the guilt in his voice, and the guilt would crack something open in her that she couldn't afford to have cracked right now. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what Romano had not said, which was as important as what he had. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not the way men sometimes looked at her, with appetite or assessment of a specific kind, but differently, with something that looked almost like calculation of a problem he'd been trying to solve for some time. She thought about the fact that a man of his resources and his stature had no rational reason to drive to a failing vineyard in Crestwood Valley and make this offer to a woman he'd never met, and that irrational actions by intelligent men always had rational explanations that simply weren't visible yet. She thought about the deed sitting on the table. Clear title, no liens. She thought about her father's hands, roughened from 40 years of working this land, folded now in front of him on the table, very still. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The real version, not what you've been telling me." Thomas Bennett was quiet for a moment, then, "The debt isn't the only one." She closed her eyes. "There's a second creditor," he said. "Smaller. 40,000, maybe 45. And the equipment loans? I'm 3 months behind on 2 of them. If Romano takes the property, the creditors come next, and then there's nothing. There's nothing left, Isla." She opened her eyes and looked at the deed. She thought about what Dante Romano's household would look like. She'd done her homework, as he'd noted. She'd done 6 weeks of it, obsessive and thorough, pulling every public record and every second-hand account she could find. She knew he had an estate outside New Haven, 22 rooms on 12 acres, a staff of 8, a security detail that was serious about its job. She knew he had no living family other than a younger brother currently serving as his financial liaison. She knew he had never been married, had never been publicly connected to anyone in a lasting way. She did not know why he wanted to marry a vineyard owner's daughter from Crestwood Valley. That was the thing that wouldn't stop pulling at her. There was something she was missing, some piece of the equation that would make the whole structure make sense. And she couldn't find it, and she had until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. "Dad," she said, "Isla, I won't ask you to— I know you won't ask me." She stood up and picked up the deed from the table and looked at it. The language was formal and clean, and the notary seal at the bottom was real. She'd seen enough of her father's property documents over the years to recognize a genuine one. "But I need to know the truth about one thing. Anything. When you borrowed the money, the man who arranged the loan, you said you met him through a mutual contact." She looked at her father. "What was his name?" Thomas Bennett frowned. "Why does that matter now?" "Because Romano came here himself," she said. "And a man like that doesn't come anywhere personally unless he needs something he can't get another way. He needs something from us, Dad. Not just from you. From this family, from this land, from something connected to us. And I need to know what it is before I walk into his house." She set the deed back down on the table. "The man's name," she said. Her father was quiet for a long time. When he finally said the name, Isla felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air coming through the old window frames. Because she recognized it. She'd heard that name before in a different context, in a piece of research she'd pulled on Romano's organization. Not prominently, not directly connected to Romano himself, but adjacent to it in the financial records of a subsidiary company that had dissolved 7 years ago under circumstances that the public filings described as routine restructuring. It wasn't routine. She knew that now. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew it wasn't routine, and she knew that the debt her father had carried for 4 years was connected to something larger and older than a simple private loan, and she knew that Dante Romano knew it too. She picked up her phone and went to her room. She had 14 hours before the car arrived or didn't arrive, and she needed every one of them. She didn't sleep. By 4 in the morning, she had 3 notebooks filled with connections she still couldn't completely untangle. A legal pad with the names of 7 companies listed in order of their dissolution dates, and a photograph on her laptop screen that she'd pulled from an archived business filing. A group shot at what appeared to be an industry event, 6 men in suits, dated 11 years ago, and 2 of the faces she recognized. One was the man her father had named. The other, standing 3 men away from him in the photograph, younger by a decade but unmistakable, was Dante Romano. They had known each other. Romano had known the man who'd arranged her father's loan before the loan ever existed, and he'd let it sit for 4 years before coming to collect. Not the money, not really, because you didn't tear up a $400,000 debt for a vineyard deed and a marriage proposal unless the money was never the point. The money was never the point. Her hands were cold when she set the laptop down. Outside the window, the pre-dawn dark was beginning to thin at the edges, that particular gray that comes before any actual light, and she sat with what she'd found and tried to determine if it changed her answer. It didn't. What it changed was what she intended to do once she was inside. At 7:45, she showered and dressed and came downstairs to find her father at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, not drinking it, just holding it. He looked up when she came in and took in the dress. She'd put on the dark one, the structured one she usually wore to meetings with banks and lawyers, and she watched him understand what it meant and watched him fight something in himself that she hoped he would not say out loud. He didn't. He was, after all, a good man. "The deed is real," she said. "I checked it against the county recorder's records online. The transfer was filed yesterday." "He was certain you'd say yes," her father said. He was prepared for either outcome. She poured herself coffee. "That's not the same thing." "Isla." His voice broke on the second syllable. "I'm sorry. I am so deeply, I know." She came around the table and put her hand on his shoulder and left it there for a moment. "Take care of the vines on the east slope. The irrigation line on the far end is losing pressure. You'll need to check the coupling before the next dry stretch." She straightened. "I'll be in touch." She didn't look back when she walked out. She was afraid of what it would do to her if she did. The car was already there, black, long, clean, a vehicle that made no statement except that its occupant had reached a point in life where statements were no longer necessary. The driver opened the door without speaking, and Isla got in and the door closed behind her with that particular quiet solidity that expensive cars have, the kind that tells you the outside world has just become a different place. She sat back and looked out at the vineyard as they pulled down the gravel drive. The east slope in the morning light, the old trellises, the house where she'd grown up, her father standing in the doorway getting smaller and smaller as they reached the end of the lane. She turned away from the window. She had a photograph on her phone. She had 3 notebooks of connections she hadn't finished drawing. She had a marriage to walk into and a secret to find, and the very clear understanding that Dante Romano was not the blunt instrument she'd expected, and that whatever was waiting for her inside that estate, it was more complicated and more dangerous than any version of events she'd constructed in the last 6 weeks. She also had, under the detachment she'd built to get through the morning, a single honest question she hadn't been able to shake since 4 o'clock. Why had Romano looked at her the way he had? Not the calculation. She understood that. Not the assessment. The other moment. The brief one at the very end when his voice had changed. When he'd said for what it's worth. What had he been going to say before he decided not to say it? The car cleared the end of the Bennett property and turned onto the main road, and the vineyard disappeared behind a curve, and Isla looked at her hands in her lap, steady and still, and thought, whatever this is, I'm going to find out what it is. And then we'll see. 3 miles down the road, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She answered it. A woman's voice, low and clipped. "Ms. Bennett, don't trust anyone on the household staff except the head of security. His name is Marcus Webb. He's the only one who answers to Dante directly. Everyone else," a pause, sharp and short, like someone cutting themselves off. "Just be careful who you eat with." The call ended. Isla looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she looked up at the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, watching her, and she made herself smile pleasantly and look back out the window as though nothing had happened at all. Her heart was moving at a rate she didn't find comfortable. Someone inside Dante Romano's world had just warned her, which meant someone inside Dante Romano's world had known she was coming before she'd gotten in this car, which meant the information had traveled from somewhere close to Romano, close enough to know the car had been dispatched, close enough to have her number. The estate appeared around a long bend, through iron gates set into a stone wall, and Isla looked at it. The scale of it, the manicured grounds, the long windows catching the morning light, and thought of a ship she'd once seen in a harbor, enormous and beautiful and built from the keel up for war. She straightened her spine. She didn't know yet who had called her. She didn't know yet what Romano wanted. She didn't know what the connection between her father's creditor and a Romano subsidiary dissolved 7 years ago actually meant, or how deep it went, or who else it touched. But she was about to find out. The gates opened and the car moved through and the stone wall closed behind her, and Isla Bennett looked straight ahead at the house that was going to be her home, and felt, under the fear and the calculation and the careful composure she was wearing like armor, something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. The car stopped. The driver came around and opened her door, and she stepped out into the morning air, which smelled of cut grass and whatever flowers grew in the beds along the front facade, and she looked up at the front entrance where a man she didn't recognize was standing at the top of the steps, watching her with an expression that was professionally blank in a way that meant he was very good at his job. He was tall, mid-40s, with a fighter's build gone slightly to stillness, the kind of man who'd made peace with the fact that he no longer needed to prove anything physically. He came down 3 steps and stopped. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm Marcus Webb. Welcome to the Romano estate." A pause. "Mr. Romano asked me to tell you that he's been delayed and won't be back until this afternoon. He's asked that you be made comfortable in the meantime." Another pause, brief, controlled. "He also asked me to tell you specifically that the east wing is yours. Private entrance. Your own key." She looked at him. "He's giving me a private entrance." "Yes, ma'am." "On the day I arrive?" "Yes, ma'am." She thought about that for a moment. A man who tears up $400,000 and gives a woman her own key on the first day is not operating from a position of control. He's operating from a position of something else. Offering. Something closer to offering than demanding. And that didn't fit the architecture she'd built of Dante Romano in her head. And the thing that didn't fit was the thing she needed to understand first. She looked at Marcus Webb. He met her eyes without flinching and without performing and without the particular quality of concealed appraisal she'd been bracing for from everyone in this place. She thought about the woman's voice on the phone. He's the only one who answers to Dante directly. "Mr. Webb," she said, "Marcus is fine." "Marcus." She held his gaze. "I'd like to see the house." "Of course." "All of it," she said. "Not the rooms I'm being offered. The rest." Something shifted in his face. Not alarm exactly. More like the adjustment a person makes when a calculation they'd been running turns out to be correct. "I'll see what I can arrange," he said. She followed him up the steps and through the front door and into a house that was nothing like what she'd expected. Not the cold museum of wealth she'd been bracing for, but something that felt, in some room-by-room, surface-level way she couldn't yet account for, almost like someone actually lived here. Photographs on the walls, real ones, not art. A jacket hung over the back of a chair in the hallway with the particular carelessness of a person who lives alone and has stopped policing their own habits. A dog's water bowl near the kitchen entrance, and the dog itself, large, old, yellow, who came out and looked at her and decided she wasn't interesting enough to get up for. Isla looked at the dog and thought, this is not the home of a man who rules people through fear. And then she thought, or it's the home of a man who's very good at wanting you to think that. She was still deciding which when Marcus Webb opened a door at the end of a corridor and showed her into a room that stopped the thought entirely. It was a study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a large desk, a window looking out over the backgrounds. All of that was ordinary enough. What wasn't ordinary was what was spread across the desk. Documents, photographs, a map with hand-annotated markings, and at the center of it, in a folder with a rubber band around it, a document she recognized. She recognized it because she'd seen a version of it in the county deed records 3 days ago. The Bennett Vineyard Survey. Not just her father's land, multiple properties. 7 of them, from what she could see, arranged on the map in a specific geographic pattern, and the marks on the map were in 2 colors. One set of marks she didn't understand, and another set that were numbered and connected by lines that traced a route through the valley. She looked at the map for exactly 4 seconds before she made herself look away, and she felt something cold and clarifying move through her understanding, the specific sensation of a thing clicking into place. This wasn't about a debt. This had never been about a debt. Someone was building something in the Crestwood Valley. Someone had needed the Bennett land and the 6 other properties on that map, and the debt had been the instrument to get it. A mechanism, engineered, designed to put pressure on families until they sold or surrendered. And Dante Romano had known about it and had come to the vineyard himself, not to collect, but to... Stop it. She didn't know yet. She was constructing a story from fragments, and she needed to be careful about constructing stories from fragments, because a story that felt coherent was not the same as a story that was true. And in this house, with this man, the difference between those 2 things was going to matter enormously. She turned away from the desk and found Marcus Webb watching her from the doorway. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "He didn't show you this room." "No." "He also didn't tell me not to." She looked at him steadily. "Is that significant?" Marcus Webb looked back at her with an expression that was, for the first time, something other than professional neutrality. It was careful, measured, the look of a man deciding in real time how much to say. "Mr. Romano," he said slowly, "has been working on something for 2 years, something he hasn't discussed with anyone in the organization. The people who work in this house, most of them don't know what's in that room." A pause. "He left it unlocked this morning." Isla's hands were very still at her sides. "He knew I'd ask to see the house," she said. "I think," Marcus said, "he was counting on it." The old yellow dog came around the corner of the corridor and settled itself against the doorframe with a sigh, and the morning light was very clear through the study window, and Isla stood in the middle of Dante Romano's private work and understood that she was not, as she had believed, walking into a trap. She was being handed the beginning of something. She just didn't know yet if the hand holding it out to her was the one she thought it was. She was still standing in the study when she heard the front door. Not the careful announced entry of a man returning to his own house. Something faster, less composed. The particular sound of a door opened by someone who'd been moving quickly and hadn't slowed down yet. Isla turned away from the desk. Marcus Webb straightened in the doorway. The old yellow dog lifted its head. Then Dante Romano came around the corner of the corridor and stopped when he saw her. He was in different clothes than this morning. The charcoal suit replaced by something darker, less formal, a jacket that looked like it had been put on in a hurry and not adjusted since. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow, recent, the kind that hadn't bled much, but had bled. He looked at her, then at the open study door behind her, and then at Marcus Webb, and something moved across his face that was too quick and too controlled for Isla to name accurately. "You're back early," Marcus said. "Meeting moved." Romano's eyes came back to Isla. "I see you found the study." "Marcus was showing me the house," she said. "You said I could see it." "I said you could see the house." He walked past her into the study and looked at the desk. She watched him assess what was visible, the map, the folder, the spread of documents, and watched him make a decision about it. He didn't touch anything. He turned back around. "How much did you look at?" "Enough to know that the map on your desk includes my father's property and 6 others," she said. "And that whatever you're building in the valley, the debt was never the mechanism you intended to use." The silence was very precise. Romano looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Give us the room." Marcus Webb left without a word, pulling the door to behind him. Not closed, not quite. Left at the particular angle of a man who would be within earshot if called, and was letting them both know it. Romano crossed to the desk and sat on the edge of it and looked at her. Up close, in the study's clear morning light, the cut above his eyebrow was more visible, and she could see now that his knuckles on his right hand were scraped. "You had a rough morning," she said. "I've had rougher." He reached up and touched the cut briefly with 2 fingers, assessing it the way someone assesses damage they've already decided they don't have time for. "Sit down, Ms. Bennett." "Isla." He paused. "What?" "If we're going to be married," she said, "you should probably use my name." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. She was beginning to recognize it, the involuntary flicker that happened when she said something he hadn't predicted. "Isla," he said, "sit down." She sat. He stayed on the edge of the desk, which put him slightly above her, and she decided not to take that personally because she didn't think it was deliberate. He had the posture of a man who stood or perched on things rather than settling into them, ready, always, to move. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "That's not a realistic starting point." "Then start with the man who arranged my father's loan." She held his gaze. "You know him. I found the photograph. You were at the same industry event 11 years ago. You're standing 3 people apart from him." Romano was very still. His name, she said, is in my notes, but I want to hear you say it. A long beat. Then, Vincent Caruso. And he arranged my father's loan on whose behalf? Mine. The word came out flat and without decoration, and Isla felt the floor shift slightly under her feet again, and she made herself hold the stillness. 4 years ago, Romano continued, I needed access to several properties in the Crestwood Valley. The Bennett vineyard was one of them. Caruso approached your father as a private investor. The loan terms were structured to be manageable initially and then to compound in a way that would eventually make the property forfeit. He paused. That was the plan. Your plan, she said. Yes. The word sat between them. She absorbed it. She had suspected it, had been building toward it since 4 a.m, had told herself she was prepared for it. And she found, hearing him say it plainly, that prepared was still the wrong word. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of that. Because you were going to find out regardless, and I'd rather tell you myself than have you discover it through whatever research channel you've been using. He looked at her with the same unsettling attention from the farmhouse. You're thorough. I should have expected that from the way you handled this morning. Don't compliment me right now, she said. It's not the right moment. He accepted that without argument, which surprised her. What changed? She asked. The plan was the loan, then the forfeit, then you acquire the property. What changed 4 years ago that made you walk away from it and let the debt sit? Romano was quiet for 3 seconds. Caruso, he said. He went off structure. The loan was supposed to be the beginning of a negotiation, an acquisition offer, a fair one, money that would have let your father retire comfortably. Caruso let the interest compound without telling me and started making private arrangements with 3 of the other property owners, arrangements I hadn't authorized. What kind of arrangements? The kind that suggest he was building something in that valley for reasons that had nothing to do with my organization, Romano said. I shut down the operation when I found out, pulled Caruso out of the field. The Bennett debt became a problem I hadn't resolved. A pause. I was getting around to it. You were getting around to it for 4 years. I had other problems. She looked at the map, then back at him. But now you're back to it. The map, the surveys, you're still trying to acquire those properties. Yes. Why? He looked at her steadily. That answer is going to require more context than we have time for this morning. Make time. His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, more like the specific friction of a man who wasn't accustomed to being told what his schedule would accommodate. Isla. Dante. She said his name for the first time, deliberately, and watched it register. You tore up $400,000 and asked me to marry you. You left your study unlocked on the morning I arrived. You're either the most straightforwardly honest man I've ever encountered, or you're running a place so sophisticated I can't see the edges of it, and I need to know which one before I eat dinner in this house tonight. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the light through the study window moved slightly, the slow morning drift of it, and the old dog groaned somewhere in the corridor. Then he said, Caruso didn't leave the field. She waited. I thought I pulled him out, Romano said. 8 months ago I started finding things. Small inconsistencies in the financial structures attached to 3 of the valley properties. Properties that had already changed hands in ways I hadn't arranged. Someone was still moving pieces in that valley, using old framework from my discontinued operation, and they were doing it under structures traceable to my organization. He stood up from the desk. If those transactions are investigated, and they will be eventually, because someone has already started asking questions at the federal level, the paper trail leads to me. Isla was very still. Someone is framing you. Someone is building a case that already has a name on it, he said. Mine. He looked at the map. The Bennett vineyard is the keystone property. It's the one piece that, if it appears in my holdings without a clean acquisition record, makes the entire structure look like what it was built to look like. Which is what? Land fraud, he said. Coercion of private property owners. Organized criminal enterprise directed at civilian targets. He said it cleanly, clinically, each charge distinct. Federal charges, Isla, the kind that don't require a conviction to destroy an organization. She sat with that for a moment. So the marriage, she said slowly. puts you in a position to provide testimony about the acquisition, he said. A voluntary transfer to a spouse is categorically different from a coerced debt collection. It changes the character of the entire transaction. He looked at her directly. I need the Bennett property to appear in my holdings as something other than a seizure. The room was very quiet. She said, You need me as a legal instrument. I need you as a witness, he said. Someone who is present, who is credible, who understands the actual history of the transaction and can speak to it accurately. He paused. Someone who does their homework. She breathed out slowly through her nose. It wasn't the whole picture, she was certain of that, but it was more of the picture than she'd had 20 minutes ago, and the part he'd told her was coherent. It hung together in a way that lies, in her experience, rarely managed to do without visible seams. Who else knows this? She asked. Marcus. One other person. In your organization? No. A beat. The person who called you this morning. She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes without blinking. You know about the call, she said. I know she made it, he said. I didn't hear what she said. She told me not to trust the household staff. She told me Marcus was the only one who answered directly to you. Isla watched his face. She sounded like someone who's been inside your operation long enough to know the difference. Something moved in his expression, not quite discomfort, but adjacent. Her name is Elena Vasquez. She worked for Caruso before she worked for me. She has information about the Valley operation that I haven't been able to get through other channels. He looked toward the window. She's also the reason I came back early this morning. She was supposed to meet me. She didn't show. The scrapes on his knuckles, the cut above his eye. She reassessed. You went looking for her, Isla said. I found where she'd been, he said, not where she is. The implication of that settled into the room quietly and with weight. Someone got to her first, Isla said. Maybe. He moved to the window and looked out at the grounds, the precise landscape, the stone paths, the gardener visible in the far distance moving along the hedge line. Or she ran. She's done it before. But his voice had the particular flatness of a man who believed one option more than the other and didn't like what he believed. Isla stood up. Her legs were slightly unsteady, which she corrected for before it showed. She walked to stand beside him at the window, not touching, but close enough that she could see his profile, the angle of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the grounds with a habitual scanning quality she recognized as threat assessment. Dante, she said. He turned slightly. If Caruso is still running an operation in the Valley, he knows you came to the Bennett property yesterday. Yes. He knows about the marriage offer. By now. He paused. Yes. Then he knows you've changed the character of the acquisition, she said, which means the paper trail he's been building to your name just became harder to use. She held his gaze, which means he's going to move faster. Romano looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the assessment, not the guarded openness, but something rawer than both. Something that looked almost like relief at being understood without having to construct the understanding first. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The door opened. Marcus Webb came through it with the particular controlled velocity of a man delivering information that can't wait, and Isla felt the shift in the room's atmosphere before he spoke. The specific change in air pressure that bad news creates when it's coming from a person who's good at carrying it. Caruso's people were at the Hendricks property this morning, Marcus said. Early, before 6. He looked at Romano. The Hendricks signed. Romano's face didn't change. Which Hendricks property? Both of them. Marcus paused. Cash offer. Significantly above market. Closed on the spot with a notary Caruso apparently travels with. Isla looked at the map. The Hendricks properties were 2 of the 7 marked positions. She could see the names now that she was looking for them, handwritten at the margins. Both on the northern edge of the valley, both adjacent to the Bennett land. He's consolidating, she said. He's accelerating, Romano corrected. His voice had gone very even. He knows we know. And he knows we can't move through legal channels fast enough to stop a cash transaction that's already closed. He looked at Marcus. Who authorized the funds? Working on that. The entity name is new, incorporated 6 weeks ago in Delaware. Shell, clearly, but the layers are clean. Whoever built it had resources. Caruso doesn't have those resources on his own. No, Marcus agreed. He doesn't. The three of them stood in the study for a moment with the map between them and the morning light going slightly harder and Isla running the numbers in her head. The geography of it, the positioning, the way the 7 properties on the map arranged themselves in relation to each other. And then she saw it. "It's not land fraud," she said. Both men looked at her. She went to the desk and picked up the map and held it toward the window so the light came through it, looking at the property lines and the route markers and the numbered positions. "This isn't about the land itself. The individual parcels aren't worth this kind of coordinated effort, not even combined. The money Caruso just spent on the Hendricks properties, the legal infrastructure to frame your organization, the years of this." She looked at the route marked in red across the map. "What runs under the valley?" Silence. She looked up at Romano. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read at all, very still, very focused. "Infrastructure," she said. "Pipeline, maybe. Or fiber. Or water rights. There's been valley water rights litigation for 30 years. That's public record. And whoever controls the contiguous property along this route," she traced the line with her finger, "controls the access corridor." She set the map down. "What is it?" Romano looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Romano. Something passed between them that she wasn't meant to see but caught anyway. The brief, involuntary exchange of two people recalibrating around a third person who has just arrived somewhere faster than anticipated. "Natural gas," Romano said finally. "There's a surveyed deposit under the valley floor. It's been in geological records for 40 years, but the access costs made it non-viable until about 6 years ago, when extraction technology made the numbers change." He looked at the map. "The mineral rights to that deposit are tied to surface ownership of the corridor properties. Whoever holds the corridor, the 7 properties on that map, controls an asset worth, conservatively, $800 million. The number sat in the room, 800 million. "And Caruso knows," Isla said. "Caruso was the one who found the geological data," Romano said. "He brought it to me originally. The original valley operation was supposed to be a legitimate acquisition. I would buy the properties, we would pursue the mineral rights jointly." His voice went flat. "What he didn't tell me was that he'd already been in conversation with a third party about a different structure, one that cut my organization out entirely and used it as a fall guy for the coercion case instead." "Who's the third party?" Isla asked. Romano's jaw tightened. "Dante." She held his gaze. "Who?" "I don't have a name," he said. "I have a structure. Offshore, layered, patient. Someone who's been planning this for a very long time and who has the resources to see it through." He looked at her directly. "Which is why I need every piece of this acquisition to be unassailable. Every transaction documented, every consent genuine, every record clean." "Which is why you need me," she said. "Yes." She looked at the map again, then out the window, then at her own hands, which were still steady, which she was grateful for. She said, "There are 5 other property owners on that map who don't know any of this." "Yes." "And Caruso is moving to acquire their land right now." "Yes." "Then we need to move first." Romano looked at her. "I know 2 of those families," she said. "The Kellermans on the South Slope. Their daughter was in my class. And the old marsh property at the valley's western end. The family has been trying to sell for 2 years. If Caruso's people show up with a cash offer and a traveling notary, they'll sign." She picked up the map and held it out to him. "What's your legal acquisition capacity right now? What can you close on within 48 hours without triggering the federal attention you're already trying to avoid?" He took the map from her. Their fingers didn't quite touch. 2 properties, maybe 3, he said, if the paperwork is clean and the prices are fair. "Then we prioritize the corridor." She pointed to the 3 central properties on the route. "These 3 block the access entirely if we hold them. Caruso can buy the periphery all he wants. Without this section, the corridor is incomplete and the mineral rights are non-viable. Romano was looking at her with that expression again, the one she didn't have a word for. "You've been in this house for 2 hours," he said. "I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks," she said. "I just didn't know what I was thinking about." For the first time, and she almost missed it because it was so brief, Dante Romano smiled. It was a real one. Not the corner of mouth flicker, but an actual involuntary thing that changed his whole face for a second before he controlled it back. "Marcus," he said, without looking away from her. "Already on it," Marcus said from the doorway. Isla set the map down. She became aware suddenly of how tired she was. The 14-hour night, the emotional topography of the morning, the sustained effort of holding herself together through a series of revelations that had each, individually, been enough to knock her sideways. The tiredness was physical, in her shoulders and the muscles around her eyes, and she became aware of it now because she'd been held up by urgency, and urgency had just momentarily released her. Romano saw it. She didn't know how. He was across the room, but he saw it. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She thought about it. "Yesterday lunch." He looked at Marcus. "Kitchen." "Already?" Marcus started. "Now." Isla started to say she didn't need handling, then decided against it. She was hungry. That was simply true, and refusing to eat to prove a point she didn't need to prove was exactly the kind of theater she'd always found exhausting in other people. She followed Marcus toward the kitchen and was almost to the corridor when she stopped and turned back. Romano was at the desk, looking at the map, and there was something in his posture in that moment, the angle of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness, that was different from every version of him she'd seen so far. Stripped of the front-facing control, for the single second he thought she wasn't looking, he looked like what he actually was. A man carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and not at all certain he could keep holding it. She looked at him for exactly that second. Then she turned away and went to the kitchen. The rest of the morning moved in a rhythm she hadn't expected. Marcus produced food that was simple and good, and she ate at the kitchen table while he made calls in the adjacent room, his voice low and clipped, and the old dog came and settled under the table near her feet with a sigh of profound contentment. She learned the dog's name was Otto. She learned, from the housekeeper who came through to collect something from the pantry, that Otto had belonged to Romano's father and was 11 years old and had been at the estate since before anyone currently on the staff had started. She learned from the housekeeper's tone when she mentioned Romano's father that the late patriarch was not warmly remembered. She stored everything. Everything was data. At noon, Romano found her in the east wing, her wing, with the private entrance and her own key, where she'd been working at the desk with her notebooks open. He came in without knocking and then stopped when he realized what he'd done and said, "Sorry," which was the last word she'd expected from him, and the sincerity of it was oddly disarming. "It's fine," she said. He stood in the doorway looking at the notebooks. "How much of this is about the valley, and how much is about me?" "Both," she said. "They're the same question." He accepted that. He leaned in the doorframe with his arms crossed and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "Elena Vasquez, I need to know what she told you on that call." She relayed it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "She used the word careful." "Yes." "Not safe, careful." "That's right." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" "Safe would mean the threat is external," he said. Careful means she knew the threat was already inside. The room went quiet. "Someone on the household staff," Isla said. "Or someone with access to the household," he said. "Access to schedules? Enough information to know a car was dispatched for you before it arrived." She thought about that. Then she thought about something else. She said everyone else except Marcus. She was very specific. Not most of the staff, not some of the staff, everyone else. Romano looked at her. "That's not a warning about a single bad actor," she said slowly. "That's a warning about a system, multiple people, or a structure, or—" She stopped, started again. "Who manages the household staff?" "My brother," Romano said. "Nico." The name landed wrong. She could feel that it did from the way he said it, the particular quality of flatness that meant he was controlling the weight of it. "Your financial liaison," she said. "Yes. Who is the only other person, besides Marcus, who knows about the federal attention?" Romano's expression didn't change. That was the tell. That it didn't change at all. "Dante," she kept her voice level. "How long have you suspected your brother?" "I haven't suspected him," he said. "I don't have evidence." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light had shifted, coming lower through the windows now, and in it the cut above his eyebrow looked older, and the tiredness that she'd seen for one unguarded second this morning was closer to the surface. 18 months, he said. The honesty of it was stark enough that she felt it physically. "Okay," she said. She closed the notebook in front of her. "Then we have a problem that's considerably more complicated than Caruso." "Yes," he said, "we do." A knock at the open door. Marcus. His face was arranged in the careful neutral of a man delivering something he'd rather not deliver. "What?" Romano said. "Two things." Marcus paused. "First, the Kellerman property. Caruso's people were there an hour ago. The family didn't sign, but they were shaken. They're calling around trying to understand what's happening." "Get me a number for the Kellermans," Isla said. Both men looked at her. "They know me. They won't sign before they talk to me." Marcus looked at Romano. Romano nodded once. "Second thing," Marcus said. His eyes moved to Romano with a steadiness that communicated, before the words did, that the second thing was worse. "Elena Vasquez was found 20 minutes ago. She's alive." A pause. "She's at Crestwood Valley General. Someone put her in a ditch off Route 9 around 4 this morning. She's concussed, 2 ribs, minor hypothermia from the overnight cold." Another pause. "She's asking for Ms. Bennett." Isla stood up. "Not you," Marcus said to Romano, and the fact that he said it, and the fact that Romano absorbed it without arguing, told her everything she needed to know about what Elena Vasquez represented, and what kind of danger Romano's visible involvement would create for her. "I'll go," Isla said. "You don't know her," Romano said. "She called me," Isla said. "Which makes me the only person in this situation she's already decided to trust." She looked at him. "And I'm your wife." The word sat oddly in the air. They hadn't signed anything. They hadn't made anything official. The word was technically premature. But she said it deliberately, and she watched him hear it, and she watched the thing it did to him, which was complicated and real. "My movements don't have the same profile as yours. Whoever put Elena in that ditch is watching what you do next. They're not watching me yet." Romano looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Take her," he said. The drive to Crestwood Valley General took 22 minutes. Isla spent them going through what she knew about Elena Vasquez, which was very little. Former Caruso operative, current Romano informant. Someone who'd known enough to call a stranger on a road this morning and give her a warning with the careful specificity of a person who understood exactly how much could be said safely and how much couldn't. A smart woman in a very dangerous position. The hospital room was small and quiet, the afternoon sun coming flat through the window blind. Elena Vasquez was smaller than Isla had imagined from the voice. Compact, dark-haired, maybe 35, with the particular look of someone who has spent years being unremarkable on purpose. The bruising along her left cheekbone was extensive and purple-edged and new. One arm was hooked to a monitor. She was awake. She looked at Isla when she came in and said, without preamble, "You went into the study." "Yes." "He left it unlocked for you." "I know." Isla pulled a chair to the bedside. "He told me about Caruso, the valley, the mineral rights." She paused. "He didn't tell me about Nico." Elena closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something in her face had settled into a different configuration. Not relief, not quite, but the specific loosening of a person who's been carrying something alone and has finally found somewhere to set it down. "Nico Romano," she said, "has been working with the offshore entity for 3 years. Isla went very still. "It's not Caruso who's framing Dante," Elena said. "Caruso is a contractor. The offshore structure, the federal paper trail, the land acquisition plan. That was built by Nico. He hired Caruso. He built the documentation structure. She stopped, breathed carefully around what was clearly a painful rib. The goal was never the mineral rights. Those are real, and the offshore entity will take them, but that was always secondary. Then what's the primary goal? Isla asked. Elena looked at her steadily. The Romano organization itself, she said. With Dante in federal custody and the organization legally compromised, the assets revert to the next of kin under the family charter. Everything Dante built, everything he runs. She paused. His brother. The room was very quiet. Nico isn't working with Caruso to steal the valley, Isla said slowly. He's working with Caruso to steal the entire Romano Empire, and he's been building it from inside the house for 3 years. Yes? Elena's voice was very flat. And last night, I told Dante's head of security what I'd found. Not Marcus, the other one. The one above Marcus in the official org chart. She looked at Isla. I thought he answered to Dante directly. He answers to Nico, Isla said. Yes, Elena said. I know that now. Which meant the warning call to Isla this morning had been the last move Elena could safely make before someone who knew she'd talked put her in a ditch on Route 9. Isla sat with the architecture of it, the scope, the patience, the years of construction, the way it had been built from the inside out, using Dante's own organizational structure as the instrument of his destruction. She thought about Romano this morning in the doorframe of her room. 18 months, the weight of a suspicion he hadn't wanted to confirm. She thought about what confirmation would do to him. She thought about the 5 remaining property owners in the valley who were about to be approached by Caruso's people with cash and a notary, and the federal investigation that was already running, and Elena Vasquez's 2 cracked ribs, and the household staff that answered to a man who wanted his brother in prison. She pulled out her phone. She had Marcus's number. She dialed it, and when he answered, she kept her voice level and said, "Get Romano and meet me at the East Wing entrance in 2 hours. Not through the main staff corridors, through the garden access." A pause. "And Marcus, don't tell anyone else you're moving him." A brief silence on his end. Then, "Understood." She ended the call and looked at Elena Vasquez, who was watching her with the focused attention of a woman who has been in dangerous rooms long enough to evaluate another person's nerve very accurately. "Can you be moved?" Isla asked. "I'm not staying here," Elena said. "Whoever sent me to that ditch knows which hospital the ambulance would bring me to. I've been waiting for someone I could trust to walk through that door." She looked at Isla steadily. "You're the only person in Dante Romano's life right now who no one has had time to turn." The word turn landed with precision. "Then get dressed," Isla said. "We're leaving." She helped Elena to the chair while the woman pulled on her clothes with the careful economy of someone working around broken ribs. And she thought about what it meant to be the only person no one had turned. And she thought about the East Wing with its private entrance and its own key. And she thought about the fact that she'd been inside this house for 6 hours and had not once felt like a prisoner. What she felt like was something considerably more dangerous than that. She felt like the only person in the entire structure who could see all of it. And as she walked Elena Vasquez toward the hospital's side exit, with one hand steadying the woman's arm and her mind moving through the sequence of what needed to happen next, she became aware, with the particular clarity that arrives when a situation has stripped away everything that isn't essential, that she had walked into Dante Romano's house this morning believing she was sacrificing her freedom to save her father. She was wrong about that. What she had actually walked into was the center of a war she hadn't known was being fought. And in the car outside the East Wing entrance 2 hours later, when she sat across from Romano and watched the moment she told him about his brother, watched the thing that crossed his face in the single second before he controlled it. Not anger, not shock, but something older and quieter and worse than either. The specific pain of a thing you already knew being confirmed by someone who has nothing to gain from lying to you. She understood that she was no longer here as a legal instrument or a witness or even an ally. She was the only person in this situation who stood entirely outside it, which meant she was the only person who could end it. Romano looked at her across the back seat of the car with that raw expression that he hadn't let her see before, and he said, very quietly, "How much time do we have?" Isla looked at him steadily. "Not much. If Nico knows Elena talked, and by now he does, he'll move the timeline. Whatever the final step in his federal filing is, he'll accelerate it." "How long?" Romano said, not a question this time. A demand directed inward at himself, the specific tone of a man running calculations he didn't want to run. "Days," Elena said from the seat beside Isla, her voice careful around the damaged ribs. "The Delaware entity filed a preliminary disclosure with the DOJ 6 weeks ago. It was structured as an anonymous tip. Dante." She paused. "The disclosure named you specifically. Dates, transactions, property records, everything Nico built over 3 years. They're waiting for one final piece of documentation before they move." "Which piece?" Romano said. "The Bennett acquisition," Elena said. "A coerced debt collection on a civilian family. That's the piece that converts the case from financial fraud into organized criminal coercion. That's what triggers the federal arrest warrant." She looked at Isla. "That's why Nico didn't want you here. A voluntary transfer to a spouse, a willing one, a documented one, destroys the coercion argument entirely." Romano turned and looked out the window at the estate grounds passing in the late afternoon light. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man holding something in place by will alone. "Nico is in the house right now," Marcus said from the front seat. "Flat, careful." "I know," Romano said. "How do you want to handle it?" The silence stretched for 4 full seconds. Isla watched Romano's profile, the cut above his eyebrow, the scrapes on his knuckles from a morning that had started with him going looking for Elena Vasquez because he'd known, on some level he hadn't let himself name yet, that someone close to him had gotten to her first. She said, "You don't confront him, not yet." Romano turned to look at her. "He can't know we know," she said. "The moment he knows, the DOJ filing gets triggered remotely. He'll have a mechanism for that, a dead man's switch on the documentation. If he goes quiet, the filing goes forward automatically." She held Romano's gaze. "We have to let him believe nothing has changed. We have to give him a reason to wait." "And what reason is that?" Romano said. "The Bennett acquisition isn't finalized yet," Isla said. "No marriage certificate, no official transfer. As long as that piece is missing, Nico has reason to hold." She paused. "So we make him watch us move toward it slowly, deliberately. We give him something to wait for." Romano looked at her for a long moment. In the fading afternoon light, his expression was something she had no precedent for. A man at the exact edge of the controlled world he'd built, looking at the one variable he hadn't placed there himself. "And while he waits?" Romano asked. "We take everything apart from underneath him," Isla said. The car stopped at the East Wing entrance. No one moved for a moment. Then Romano said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "We're going to need more than 3 days." "I know," Isla said, "and Caruso is still moving in the valley." "I know that too." He looked at her. "Are you scared?" She considered lying, then, "Yes." "Good," he said. "People who aren't scared make mistakes." He opened the car door. "Let's go inside." They put Elena in the East Wing's second bedroom, which shared a wall with Isla's room and had a window that faced the garden access road rather than the main grounds. Marcus brought a medical kit without being asked. Isla set her own chair against the connecting door between the 2 rooms, not locked, just present, and went back to her notebooks. Romano disappeared into the main house. She heard him, once, through the walls. Not words, just the particular cadence of a voice being kept controlled in a conversation that wanted to be something else. She assumed it was Nico. She didn't go to listen. She needed Nico Romano to believe, for as long as possible, that she was exactly what she'd appeared to be this morning, a frightened woman from a failing vineyard who'd accepted an arrangement she didn't fully understand. The believing had to be total. Any crack in it, and the dead man's switch triggered, and Dante Romano went to prison for his brother's crimes, and the valley went to the offshore entity, and Elena Vasquez's cracked ribs would have been for nothing. So Isla sat in the East Wing and worked. She had the geographical survey data she'd photographed on her phone before leaving the study. She had 3 notebooks and a legal pad. She had Elena, who slept in the next room in the medicated, effortful way of someone whose body was insisting on recovery, regardless of what her mind thought about the timing. And she had, in the back of her consciousness, a constant low-level awareness of the house around her, its sounds, its rhythms, the movement of people through it. At 9 in the evening, there was a knock at her door. She said, "Come in," and it was not Romano, and it was not Marcus. The man who opened her door was younger than Dante by perhaps 8 years. Same angular build, same dark coloring, but assembled differently. The features softer, the eyes quicker, and more surface level in the way of someone who'd grown up being the less scrutinized one and had learned to use that. He was dressed casually, and he was smiling, and the smile was excellent. She would have believed it completely if she hadn't spent the last 4 hours building an understanding of what he'd done. "You must be Isla," he said. "I'm Nico. I'm sorry I missed your arrival. I was in the city." He came in without being invited, which was a family trait apparently, and looked around the room with a proprietary ease that suggested he considered the East Wing, like everything else in the estate, his eventual inheritance. "I wanted to welcome you properly. Dante doesn't always... He's not good at the social parts." "He's been fine," Isla said. "Good." He looked at her notebooks on the desk. "Working already?" "Old habit," she said. "I managed most of the vineyard's operations for the last decade. I don't do well without something to organize." He picked up the top notebook, and she made herself not react, made herself sit easily in the chair and watch him with the mild expression of a woman who has nothing to hide. And he flipped through the first few pages, the early vineyard notes, the financial summaries she'd kept for years, nothing connected to anything he'd recognize, and set it back down. "Smart woman," he said pleasantly. "Dante needs someone smart." "Does he?" she said. "He's very good at running things," Nico said. "He's not always good at seeing the full picture. He gets focused." He smiled again. "I've spent my whole life filling in the parts he misses." She looked at him steadily and kept her face at polite attention and thought, "You have spent your whole life standing in his shadow, cataloging everything he couldn't see and building a structure to take it from him, and you are standing in my room right now because you want to assess how much I know, and I'm going to give you exactly nothing." "That sounds like a hard job," she said. "Family," he said, with a shrug that was perfectly calibrated. Then, "Elena Vasquez. I heard she was found this morning. Apparently she'd been in an accident." The word accident was said so cleanly, so conversationally, that a less prepared person would have taken it at face value. Isla took a breath and held the pleasant expression. "I heard that too," she said. "Terrible." "Did Dante mention anything about it?" "He said he'd worked with her before, some kind of informant." She let a small, slightly overwhelmed look cross her face, the look of a woman newly arrived in a complex world she was still processing. "I'm trying not to ask too many questions too fast. It seemed like it upset him." Nico watched her for a moment with those quick, surface-level eyes. She could feel the assessment running. She let him run it. "Of course," he said. "It's a lot to absorb." Another smile. "If you need anything, anything at all, and I mean that, you come to me. Not the staff, not Marcus. He's protective of Dante to a fault, and sometimes that makes him..." A small pause. "Not the most welcoming to newcomers. I'm the easier door." "I'm the easier door." She filed that away with everything else. "Thank you, Nico," she said warmly. "That's kind." He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and counted to 30, and then let out a breath that had been waiting in her chest since he'd picked up the notebook. She went to the connecting door and knocked softly. Elena's voice, awake. "I heard." Isla opened the door. Elena was sitting up in bed, her face pale and tight around the damaged ribs, and her eyes were completely alert. "He came to look at you," Elena said. "Yes." "Did he find anything?" "No." Isla leaned in the door frame. "He called the attack on you an accident." "Of course he did." Elena's voice was flat. "He's been calling things accidents for 3 years." "What else has he called an accident?" Elena looked at her for a moment, then she said, "How much do you know about how Dante's father died?" The room went very still. "Heart attack," Isla said. 8 years ago. It's in every public record connected to the Romano family. Yes, Elena said. It is. The way she said it moved through Isla like cold water. Elena. I don't have proof, Elena said. I want to be clear about that. What I have is a pattern. Financial transfers in the 18 months before the death, a shift in the family charter that Nico drafted and his father signed 6 weeks before he died, and a cardiologist who retired to Portugal immediately after the funeral and has never practiced medicine again. She looked at Isla steadily. Dante doesn't know. I didn't tell him because I don't have proof and because… She stopped. Because it would break something in him that I don't think he can afford to have broken right now. Isla stood in the doorway for a long moment. She thought about Romano this morning saying 18 months like the words had weight. She thought about the way he'd absorbed the news about Nico with that specific pain she'd recognized as confirmed suspicion, not new shock. She thought about a man who had run his family's organization for 8 years carrying the grief of a father's death and the slow, unwanted accumulation of evidence pointing toward the brother who was supposed to be his closest ally. She thought about what it would do to him to know it might not have been a heart attack. You're right, she said. Not yet. When? When we have proof, Isla said. When it can be delivered alongside something that makes it survivable. She pushed off the doorframe. Sleep. I need you functional tomorrow. She went back to her desk. She did not sleep. At 2 a.m, Romano came. He knocked, which she was learning was not his default. And she said, come in, and he entered the room with the particular quality of a man who has been awake longer than her and has spent the hours since they last spoke inside something difficult. He sat in the chair by the window without being offered it and looked out at the dark grounds and said nothing for a moment. She waited. Nico came to see you, he said. Yes. What did he say? She told him, the welcome, the notebook, the offer to be the easier door, the word accident. She told him all of it cleanly and without editorializing and watched Romano take it in with his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who has been managing his own reactions to his brother for long enough that the management is almost unconscious. Almost. He's suspicious, Romano said. Not fully, not yet. I gave him nothing. He'll come back. I know. She looked at him. We need the Kellerman contact tomorrow. If Caruso moves on the Central Corridor properties before we do, the mineral rights case is gone, and the only thing left is the federal filing, which Nico controls the timeline on. I called the Kellermans tonight, Romano said. They'll meet with you tomorrow morning. Neutral location. There's a diner in the valley, the one on Route 12. They'll be there at 8. You called them yourself? You were right that they wouldn't respond to me. I called them as an introduction. The conversation is yours. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then, what else did Elena tell you? The question was careful, too careful. The specific carefulness of a man who is asking about one thing and bracing for another. She looked at him directly. She told me what she knows about Nico's timeline, the Delaware filing, the DOJ disclosure. She kept her voice even. That's what we focused on. He held her gaze. Something in his face, a very small thing, in the muscles around his eyes, relaxed slightly. He believed her. Or he chose to believe her, which was the same thing for now. Get some sleep, he said. He stood. Dante. He stopped. I need you to understand something, she said. She'd been working up to this for the last hour, assembling the words for it, because it mattered that it was said correctly. What we're doing right now, the Kellermans, the acquisition documentation, moving Nico away from the trigger, all of that can work. The legal structure holds if we execute it correctly. She looked at him steadily. But you have to be prepared for the fact that executing it correctly means your brother walks into a room eventually and finds out that everything he built is gone, and that you were the one who took it. A pause. Are you prepared for that? Romano looked at her for a long time. I've been prepared for that, he said quietly. For 18 months. He left. She turned back to the desk and picked up her pen and stared at the legal pad without seeing it, and thought about what Elena had told her about Romano's father, and what it meant, and what it would cost when it eventually came out. and whether the man she'd watched walk out of this room had any idea how much worse the thing he was braced for was actually going to be. She didn't sleep until 4. When she did, it was brief and without rest. At 7:15, she was dressed and downstairs, and Marcus drove her to the Route 12 diner in a car that was unremarkable by design, and she arrived 7 minutes before 8 and ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window where she could see the parking lot. The Kellermans arrived at 2 minutes past 8. Frank Kellerman, 60, weathered in the specific way of a man who's worked land his whole life. His wife Carol, who Isla remembered from school events as a quiet woman with her daughter's same direct eyes. Their daughter, Meg, same age as Isla, the one who'd sat 2 rows behind her in junior year English, who'd apparently come for reasons that became clear when she said before she'd even sat down properly. They came back last night. Isla looked at her. Caruso's people, Meg said. Different man than yesterday, older, and he wasn't asking anymore. He told my father the offer expires at noon today. She looked at Isla with the contained panic of someone who's been managing their parents' fear since yesterday morning. He said if we don't sign by noon, the offer goes to 0 and we find other ways to lose the property. She sat down. What does that mean? What does lose the property mean from someone like that? Isla thought of 4 answers and chose the honest one. It means they'll find a liability in your title records or your tax filings and use it as leverage. It's a standard pressure mechanism. Is there a liability in our title records? I don't know yet, Isla said, but I know someone who can check within the hour. She looked at Frank Kellerman, who had the same look her father had worn for 6 weeks. The look of a man maintaining composure over something that was costing him the composure of the previous decade. Mr. Kellerman, the offer they're making you, whatever the dollar figure is, it's not about your land. I need you to understand that. Then what's it about? Frank said. She told him. Not everything. Not the federal filing, not Nico Romano, not $800 million in mineral rights. She told him what he needed in order to make a decision, that his land sat on a corridor that was worth significantly more than the cash being offered, that the entity making the offer had a pattern of acquiring distressed properties through manufactured pressure, and that she was in a position to make him a competing offer before the noon deadline that reflected the actual value of what he held. Frank Kellerman stared at her for a long moment. You're Romano's wife. I will be, she said. Yes. Romano is the reason my neighbor's family lost their property 6 years ago. She didn't flinch. Yes. And Romano is the one funding the competing offer I just described, and he knows that those 2 facts are both true, and he's not asking you to forgive the first one. He's asking you to consider the second one on its own merits. She held Frank's gaze. I'm asking you to consider it. The diner was quiet around them. Outside in the parking lot, a truck pulled in and 2 men got out, and Isla watched them peripherally, and they went inside without looking at the booth, and she let herself breathe. Frank looked at his wife. Carol Kellerman looked back at him with the steady expression of a woman who'd already decided and was waiting for her husband to get there too. He looked at Isla. What are the terms? She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. A single, deliberate nod, the kind that commits. Get me the paperwork. I'll have it to you by 11. She called Marcus from the parking lot and gave him the terms and told him the documentation needed to be at the Kellerman property by 10:45, and she was getting back into the car when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, with the particular composed quality of a man who has never been rushed in his life because he has never needed to be. Miss Bennett, the voice said. Or I suppose it's Ms. Romano now. Congratulations. She said nothing. My name isn't important, the voice said. What's important is that you've had a very productive 24 hours and I've been watching with genuine admiration. The Kellerman acquisition was a smart move. A pause. It's also the last one you'll be able to make. Her hand tightened on the phone. I'm going to give you some information, the voice said, because I think you deserve to have it before things move forward, and because what happens next isn't personal. A pause. The federal filing isn't in Nico Romano's control. She went very still. It never was, the voice said. Nico is a useful instrument. He always has been. But the filing, the documentation structure, the timeline, the trigger, that belongs to me. Has for 2 years. A pause. Nico thinks he's been running an operation. What he's actually been doing is running mine. She stood in the parking lot with the morning sun at a hard angle and felt something shift in her understanding so fundamentally that the last 24 hours of architecture rearranged itself into a completely different shape. Nico wasn't the architect. Nico was another instrument. There was someone above him, someone who had been above him the entire time, using the Romano brothers' conflict as the mechanism, building the federal case against Dante while letting Nico believe he was in control of it, which meant, "The dead man's switch," she said. Her voice was flat and calm in a way that was costing her something she could feel at the base of her throat. "It's not Nico's." "No," the voice said pleasantly, "it isn't." Which means neutralizing Nico doesn't stop the filing. "Correct," she breathed, in, out. "What do you want?" "The Bennett vineyard," the voice said. "Specifically, not Romano's competing acquisitions, not the corridor as a whole. Just that one property, the Keystone. Transfer it to a third-party entity I'll name, keep Romano's organization out of the chain of title entirely, and the federal filing disappears. Dante Romano walks free. Your father keeps his house." A pause. "Everyone gets something they want. Except Romano gets nothing," she said. "Romano gets his freedom," the voice said. "That's not nothing." She said, "Give me 12 hours. "You have 6, the voice said. "After that, the filing goes forward on its automated schedule regardless of what I want. I have that much control, not more." A beat. "6 hours, Ms. Bennett. Talk to your husband." The call ended. She stood very still in the parking lot for approximately 15 seconds. Then she got in the car and said to Marcus, "Drive." And when he asked where, she said, "Just drive, I need a minute." And he drove without asking again, and she sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at them and thought with the cold, clear precision of someone who has just had the ground taken out from under them and is determining which way is down. The voice was the offshore entity, not the Delaware shell. Deeper than that, the originating structure, the patient one. The one with the resources to build a 3-year federal case and the subtlety to use a man's own brother as an unwitting instrument. This was not Caruso's operation. This was not even Nico's. This was something older and more deliberate than anything she'd been calculating for, and it had been sitting above the entire structure the whole time, invisible, watching her work, and it had waited until she'd made enough productive moves to be genuinely useful before picking up the phone, because it wanted her to make the choice. Not Romano, her. The Bennett vineyard, her father's land, restored, deed transferred, no liens sitting in Thomas Bennett's name since yesterday morning. Free and clear, and now the specific object of a demand from a man whose name she didn't know, backed by a federal case she couldn't stop. With a 6-hour window and a husband she was going to have to walk back to and tell that the war they'd been fighting had a different general than either of them had known. She thought about her father standing in the farmhouse doorway this morning, getting smaller in the rear window. She thought about what it would do to him to lose the land twice. She thought about Dante Romano's face when she told him. "Marcus," she said. "Yes. When we get back to the estate, who in the main house knows where Romano is right now?" A pause. Nico would know his general schedule. "Is Nico there?" "He was in his office when I left." She thought for a moment. "Take me to the garden entrance. Don't go through the main gate." Understood. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo she'd taken of the study map and looked at it. The 7 properties, the corridor, the route markings. And she looked at the Bennett land, center of the map, center of everything. And she sat with the fact that whatever she decided in the next 6 hours was going to be irreversible. The car turned toward the estate and the valley came into view through the window. The Crestwood Basin, green and gold in the morning light. The vineyard visible on the far eastern slope. The old trellises her grandfather built. The east slope vines she'd told her father to watch the irrigation on when she'd walked out the door this morning, not looking back. She looked at it now. Then she put the phone away. Romano was in the library when she found him, alone, with documents spread across the reading table and the expression of a man who'd been working since before she'd left for the diner. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face immediately, the way she was beginning to understand he read most things, fast, accurate, and without the comfort of being wrong very often. "What happened?" he said. She closed the library door. She walked to the table and she stood across from him with her hands flat on the surface, and she looked at him and she told him everything. The call, the voice, the offshore entity above Nico, the dead man's switch that Nico had never controlled, the 6-hour window, the demand. She told him all of it, cleanly, without softening any of it, and she watched it land. He was very still while she talked. He didn't interrupt, didn't move, didn't change his expression in any way she could track. When she finished, the library was very quiet, and he looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "They want you to hand over your father's land," he said, "to end this." "Yes." "And they called you, not me." "Yes, because they know," he said slowly, "that if they called me, I'd refuse." "Yes, but they think you might not." She held his gaze. "They're betting I'll choose my father over your organization." "Will you?" The question sat between them, bare, without insulation, the most direct thing he'd said to her in 24 hours of very direct conversation. His eyes on hers were absolutely steady, and she understood that he was not asking it as a challenge or an accusation, but as a genuine question, the kind that a man asks when he needs to know the actual answer, because the answer determines everything that comes next. She said, "I haven't decided yet." He absorbed that. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who respects an honest answer he doesn't like. "Then we have 6 hours," he said. 5.5 now, she said. He looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked up at her again and said, "There's something I haven't told you." The quality of the silence changed. She made herself stay still. "The original Valley operation," he said. 4 years ago, when I found out what Caruso had done, the unauthorized arrangements with the other property owners, the compounding interest on your father's loan, I told you I shut it down." He looked at her directly. "That's true. What I didn't tell you is why I came back to it now. Why this year specifically." She waited. 8 months ago I received a document," he said. "Anonymous. Delivered to this house through the staff mail, which means someone inside the estate sent it or facilitated its delivery." He reached into the documents on the table and produced a sealed envelope, still sealed, and set it between them. "I haven't opened it." She stared at the envelope. "Why not?" "Because the return information on the outside," he said, "is my father's handwriting." The room was completely silent. "Your father has been dead for 8 years," she said. "Yes." His voice was completely controlled. It was the most frightening thing she'd heard him say. "Which means either someone is using his handwriting to manipulate me, or someone who knew my father sent this before they died, or—" He stopped. "Or someone has been sitting on it for 8 years, she said slowly, and chose now to surface it. "Yes." She looked at the envelope, then at him. "You've been carrying this for 8 months without opening it." "I needed to know who sent it before I opened it," he said, "because whatever is inside changes the shape of everything. I knew that without knowing the contents, and if I opened it without knowing the source, I'd be reacting to information I couldn't verify in a situation designed by someone I couldn't identify." He looked at her steadily. "Now I have 6 hours, and someone who just told me the offshore entity is older and more patient than anything I've been calculating for, and I think—" He stopped. "I think the envelope is from them." "As a weapon," she said. "Or as a lever," he said, "to move me in a direction they need me to move." She looked at the envelope for a long moment, at the handwriting she couldn't see from this angle but that he'd described as his dead father's. "Open it," she said. "Isla." "Open it," she said again. "We have 5 hours and 20 minutes, and we cannot plan around something we haven't read. Whatever it is, we deal with it." She held his gaze. "Together." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up the envelope and opened it. He read it standing up, which she'd come to understand was how he processed things that mattered. On his feet, body ready for whatever the information required. She watched his face while he read. She watched the control he was maintaining, the absolute suppression of reaction, and she watched it hold for most of the reading, and then, near the end, in a single unguarded second, she watched it fail. It was brief. A single contraction of the muscles around his eyes, a sharp exhale through his nose, the specific physical response of a man who has received a blow he was not, despite everything, actually prepared for. His hand tightened on the page. Then the control came back, slower than usual, and he set the letter on the table and stood very still with his hand flat on top of it. She waited. "My father didn't have a heart attack," he said. The words came out level, completely level, the levelness of a man who is detached from what he's saying because attaching to it would make it impossible to say. She thought of Elena last night, the cardiologist who'd retired to Portugal. "I don't have proof." This was the proof. "The letter is from his physician," Romano said, "the one who signed the death certificate. He wrote this 6 months before he died himself. Stroke, 2 years ago, in Lisbon. He left instructions for it to be delivered to me on a specific date." He paused. "The date was 8 months ago." "What does it say?" "That my father's final cardiac event was induced," Romano said. "That the medication administered at the estate that morning was not what the prescription indicated. That the physician was present, that he falsified the certificate, and that he was paid to do both." He looked up from the letter. "The payment came through a financial structure he describes in detail." She already knew. The offshore entity. "Yes." "And who authorized it?" she said. "Does he say who authorized it?" Romano looked at her. The rawness she'd seen briefly last night was fully present now, undisguised, and it was worse than she'd anticipated. Not just grief, not just rage, but the specific devastation of a man who has spent 8 years believing one story about the worst thing that ever happened to him, and has just been handed a different one. "Nico," he said, countersigned, age 23. He breathed. He was 23 years old. The library held that. She crossed to the table and picked up the letter herself and read it. The physician's handwriting was old-fashioned and precise, the language formal, the details clinical. It read like a confession from a man who had waited until he was dying to say the true thing, which was exactly what it was. She set it down. "This is what they're holding over the operation," she said. "If this surfaces through the wrong channel, through them, time to the federal filing, framed to implicate the entire Romano structure in the death, it doesn't just destroy you legally, it destroys everything." She looked at him. "Every alliance, every legitimate operation you've built, every person who's tied to this name." "Yes," he said. "They've had this for 2 years," she said, "and they've been waiting." "For what?" She picked up her phone and looked at the time and then looked at him and said, "For me." He stared at her. "They needed the Bennett vineyard to complete the land corridor," she said slowly, working it through as she spoke. "They couldn't get it from you. You'd never sell under pressure. That's not who you are. They couldn't manufacture a clean acquisition the way they did with the others because by then you were watching, so they needed a third party." She held his gaze. "Someone connected to the property by blood who could make a voluntary transfer that would hold up legally. Someone you'd brought inside your own house." She set the phone down. "They didn't call me this morning because they thought I'd betray you. They called me because the entire operation, 3 years of it, was always designed to end with me making that choice." The silence was total. "I was never incidental to this," she said. "Your father's debt to Caruso, the loan structure, the way the pressure was applied to my father specifically, it was all a mechanism to put me in a position where I'd come to you and you'd bring me inside, and eventually they'd show me the lever and ask me to use it." She breathed. "The marriage offer. Did you think of it yourself?" Romano looked at her, and in the long, terrible second before he answered, she watched him understand the same thing she was understanding, that they had both been moved, carefully and patiently, into exactly this room, at exactly this moment, holding exactly these pieces. "Caruso suggested it," he said quietly, 3 months ago, when I was looking for a way to clean the acquisition record. His voice dropped further. He said a voluntary spousal transfer would be legally unassailable. The room tilted slightly. Caruso, who worked for the offshore entity, who had suggested the mechanism that would deliver Isla Bennett to this house, to this table, to this letter, to this exact moment. "We've been choreographed," she said. "Yes," Romano said. 4 hours and 50 minutes left on the clock. She picked up the letter and looked at it one more time and thought about her father's hands on the kitchen table and the East Slope vines and the deed with the notary seal and everything she'd walked away from yesterday morning, and then she put the letter down and looked at Dante Romano. This man she'd known for 30 hours, this stranger who was supposed to be her husband, this person who was standing in front of her with the worst thing that had ever happened to him newly broken open in his chest. And she made a decision that she understood with absolute clarity she could not take back. "We're not giving them the vineyard," she said. He looked at her. "And we're not running," she said. "We're going to use the letter." "Isla, they choreographed this," she said. "They put us in this room with this letter and this timeline because they needed a specific outcome, which means the letter is real, the documentation is real, and in the right hands, the right federal hands, the ones not connected to the offshore entity, it doesn't destroy the Romano organization." Her voice was completely steady. "It destroys them." Romano stared at her for a long moment. In his face, she could see everything: the grief, the calculation, the exhaustion of 8 years of carrying something without knowing its full weight, and underneath all of it, very quiet, the specific look of a man deciding whether to trust someone completely. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Everything you have on the Delaware entity. Every financial record, every name Caruso ever gave you." She picked up her phone. "And Elena. I need Elena right now." She was already dialing Marcus when Romano reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers, not stopping her, just present, just for a second, and then let go. She registered it and kept dialing. They had 4 hours and 40 minutes, a dead man's letter, and no margin for anything except exactly right. Elena was on her feet before Marcus finished knocking. She came through the connecting door in the clothes she'd slept in, her dark hair pulled back, moving with the careful economy of someone managing pain without letting it manage her. And she looked at the letter on the library table and then at Romano's face and then at Isla and said, "How long do we have?" 4 hours 40, Isla said. "Sit down." "I'm better standing." "Your ribs are fine. Talk." So Isla talked. She laid it out in sequence. The call, the voice, the offshore entity above Nico, the letter, the physician's confession, the choreography of the last 4 years delivered as a single coherent structure to two people who were hearing most of it for the first time in its complete shape. She talked for 8 minutes without stopping. Elena listened without moving. Romano stood at the window with his back to the room, which she understood was how he processed things he needed to absorb, without his face giving them away. When she finished, Elena said, "The physician's documentation? Is it specific enough to trace the financial chain?" "The entity structure he describes matches the Delaware shell," Romano said, without turning. "Partially. Enough to establish a link, not enough to close it." "Then we need the gap filled," Elena said. She looked at Isla. "Caruso has the full chain. He built it. Every layer, every transfer. He'd know where the documentation lives." "Caruso is working for the entity," Isla said. "Caruso is working for whoever is paying him," Elena said. "That's different." She looked at Romano's back. "How much does he currently believe you know?" Romano turned. "Nothing. As of yesterday, Caruso thinks the Valley operation is still running on his timeline. He doesn't know about the call this morning. He doesn't know about the letter." "Then he still thinks he's protected," Elena said, "which means he hasn't moved his documentation off-site yet." She looked between them. "Where does Caruso operate from?" "New Haven. He has an office above a restaurant on Crown Street and a secondary location in the old port district that's not in any public record." Romano's jaw tightened. "The port location is where he keeps anything he doesn't want found. Can you get there in an hour? 40 minutes? Then we need 2 things happening simultaneously," Isla said. She was already at the table, already writing. "Someone gets to Caruso's port location and gets the documentation before he knows we're looking. At the same time, we need the federal contact, the clean one, not connected to the offshore entity's DOJ channel, ready to receive what we pull. I have a contact, Elena said. Assistant U.S. Attorney in the district. She's been building a parallel case on the offshore entity for 14 months, separate track from whatever Nico's filing is pointed at. She doesn't know about the physician's letter. She will in 3 hours, Isla said. Romano looked at her. If we go to a federal prosecutor with this, there's no containing where it goes afterward. Everything comes out. My father's death, Nico's involvement, the Valley operation, my original acquisition plan. He paused. All of it. Yes, Isla said. I know. Including the part where I sent Caruso to manufacture a loan that put your father's land at risk. She met his gaze directly. Yes, including that. The library was very quiet. This ends your organization as it currently exists, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact that needed to be on the table between them, stated plainly, before they went any further. You know that. Yes, he said. You've known that was the likely outcome since you decided to fight this instead of run. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then we're aligned. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has made peace with the cost of the decision he's making, which is different from the nod of a man who's comfortable with it. Marcus, Romano said. Marcus appeared in the doorway. He'd been in the corridor the entire time, she realized, close enough to hear, far enough to give them the room. Already thinking about the port location. You can't go, Romano said. If Nico is monitoring movement from the estate, my head of security leaving triggers an alert. He looked at Marcus steadily. Who do we have that Nico doesn't have eyes on? A pause. The Kellerman acquisition. Your property lawyer drove out this morning. Reyes, Romano said. She's still at the Kellerman property finalizing the paperwork. She doesn't come back through the estate. She goes direct to her office in the city. Marcus paused. Her office is 4 blocks from the port district. Romano looked at Isla. Does she know what she'd be walking into? Isla asked. Reyes has been my attorney for 9 years, Romano said. She knows more about what she'd be walking into than anyone else I could send. Call her, Isla said. Romano pulled out his phone and walked to the far corner of the library and made the call in a low voice. Isla turned to Elena. Your AUSA contact. Can she receive documentation directly without running it through the official intake channel first? If I call her personally and explain the source, yes. Elena's face was tight around the damaged ribs, but her eyes were completely focused. She trusts me. We've been working parallel for 8 months without officially coordinating. She knows I've been inside the Romano operation. She knows I'm not a hostile source. Make the call, Isla said. Tell her we're bringing her the physician's letter, the Delaware entity structure, and whatever Reyes pulls from the port location. Tell her we need a clean arrest warrant path that doesn't run through any channel the offshore entity has had contact with. She'll want Romano's cooperation. She'll have it, Isla said. She looked at Romano across the room, still on his call. He met her eyes and nodded without pausing his conversation. She turned back to Elena. Go. Elena went to the corner with her own phone. The library became a room of 2 simultaneous, low-voiced conversations, and Isla stood between them at the table with the physician's letter in front of her and 4 hours and 19 minutes on the clock, and let herself have 30 seconds of pure, undisguised fear. The real thing, the kind she'd been compressing since yesterday morning, the kind that lived in the chest and made the hands want to shake. And then she put it away and picked up her pen. She made a list. Every piece of documentation they needed, in order of acquisition priority, with the name next to each one of who was responsible for getting it. She was on item 7 when the library door opened. Nico Romano walked in. He looked at the table, the letter, the notebooks, the legal pad with Isla's handwriting, and then at Elena in the corner on the phone, and then at his brother across the room, and she watched the calculation run behind his eyes in the 2 seconds before anyone spoke, watched him assess and find more than he'd expected. Watched something shift in his face that he controlled almost fast enough. Almost. Morning meeting? He said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. Property documentation, Isla said immediately. She stepped slightly to the left, blocking his sightline to the physician's letter without making it look like she was blocking anything. The Kellerman acquisition is finalizing, and there are 3 other properties we're trying to move on before the noon deadline. It's a lot of paperwork. He looked at her. You've been busy. I told you, she said. Old habit. I don't do well without something to organize. She smiled at him. She used the warmth she'd used last night, the slightly overwhelmed warmth of a new arrival still finding her footing, and she held it steady and natural, and she watched him decide whether to believe it. Romano ended his call and turned around. The 2 brothers looked at each other across the library, and the look contained 8 years of history and 18 months of Romano's private suspicion and the entirety of what was in the physician's letter, and none of that was visible on either of their faces, and it was the most controlled thing Isla had ever watched 2 human beings do. Nico, Romano said, what do you need? I wanted to talk about the Hendricks acquisition, Nico said, still pleasant, still watchful. The entity that bought them out. I've been looking at the structure, and I think there might be a way to challenge the transaction if the notarization was non-standard. I'll look at it this afternoon, Romano said. I'd rather go through it now. A pause. While everyone's here. The request was so precisely calibrated, the reasonable tone, the fraternal ease, the timing that would delay Romano from moving for the next hour, that Isla felt it as a physical thing, the specific weight of a very intelligent person applying pressure through the appearance of its absence. She said, I actually need Dante for the next hour. The Kellerman paperwork has his signature requirements, and the deadline is 11. She looked at Nico with pleasant apology. Could it wait until this afternoon? I'd feel better once these acquisitions are locked. Nico looked at her. The pleasantness in his face was perfect and entirely empty. Of course, he said, this afternoon. He looked at his brother one more time, a look that lasted exactly 1 second too long. And then he left. The door closed. No one in the room moved for 3 full seconds. Then Romano said very quietly, He knows. He suspects, Isla said. There's a difference. He came in here to read the room and he got less than he needed. She looked at the door. But we just lost time we didn't have. She looked at Marcus. How long before he makes a move? If he thinks the operation is compromised, Marcus said, less than an hour. He'll go for the trigger. Where is it? Isla asked. The dead man's switch. Where does he physically access it? His office, Marcus said. 3rd floor. There's a system. Can you lock him out of it? Not without him knowing I've locked him out. She thought for 3 seconds. Then we don't lock him out. We give him something else to look at. She turned to Romano. The Hendricks challenge he mentioned. Is there any legitimacy to it? Possibly, Romano said slowly. Then take the meeting with him. This afternoon, 2 o'clock. Make it real. Pull the actual Hendricks documents. Have Reyes on the phone. Make it look like the entire organization is focused on that transaction. She held Romano's gaze. Keep him in that meeting for 90 minutes. And in those 90 minutes, Romano said, Reyes gets to the port location. Elena's AUSA contact gets the letter, and I go talk to Caruso. The room went completely silent. Romano stared at her. No. He doesn't know who I am to you yet, she said. Not really. He knows the structure. He arranged it, but he hasn't met me and he doesn't have a read on me. I'm the only person in this situation who can walk into his location without triggering every defensive mechanism he has. You're also the only person in this situation who has no training for... I ran a failing business through 3 creditors and a bank refusal and managed my father through 4 years of a debt he was ashamed of, she said. I know how to sit across from a man who has power over me and get information out of him without letting him know that's what I'm doing. She held his gaze. I've been doing it since I was 22. Romano looked at her with an expression that was complicated and tight and losing the argument. 2 conditions, he said. Name them. Marcus goes with you. He waits outside, but he's there. Done. And you don't go in until Reyes has confirmed the port location documents are accessible. If Caruso has already moved them, you walk away. No improvising. She considered arguing. She decided he was right. Done. Then go, he said. You have 4 hours and... He looked at the clock. 3 hours and 51 minutes. She picked up her phone and the legal pad and the photograph. The group shot, 11 years ago, Caruso and Romano 3 men apart. And she was at the door when he said her name. She turned. He looked at her across the library with everything he wasn't going to say visible in his face for exactly the length of a breath. "Be careful," he said. "I know," she said. She went. The drive to New Haven took 38 minutes. Marcus drove and didn't talk, which she was grateful for because she spent the 38 minutes going through every version of the Caruso conversation she could construct, mapping his likely responses, finding the angles. She knew his type from the research, not Dante's type, not the controlled precision of a man who'd built something real, but the other kind. The one who'd spent his career as the indispensable instrument of more powerful men and had mistaken that indispensability for power of his own. Men like that had a specific vulnerability. They needed to be seen as architects. Her phone buzzed at the 40-minute mark. Reyes. Port location confirmed accessible. Documents present. I have copies. Getting out now. She showed the screen to Marcus without speaking. He nodded. Crown Street office or the port location? He asked. Crown Street, she said. That's where he'll be? The port location is for storage, not operation. She looked at the address she'd pulled from Romano's files. He won't know Reyes was there yet. We have a window. Small one, Marcus said. Small is enough. The restaurant above which Caruso kept his office was a mid-range Italian place that wasn't open for lunch and had a side entrance with a buzzer system that Marcus assessed for approximately 4 seconds before finding a technical solution to it that Isla didn't ask him to explain. They went up a narrow staircase that smelled of old cooking and emerged into a corridor with 2 doors, one of which had a frosted glass panel with light behind it. She knocked. A pause. Then, "Come." Vincent Caruso was 60, thick-set, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more practical. Watchful eyes, a wide jaw, the particular stillness of a man who made his living reading other people's tells. He was at a desk with a laptop open and a coffee cup at his elbow, and he looked at her with recognition he almost hid. Almost. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Caruso." She sat down across from him without being invited, the way Romano had sat down in her father's farmhouse 2 days ago, and she watched Caruso register the echo of it. "I need about 15 minutes of your time." "I don't believe we have an appointment." "We don't," she said, "but you arranged my marriage, so I think that earns me 15 minutes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and gave her the look of a man deciding how much rope to extend. "What can I do for you?" "I need to understand my position," she said. She let a note of genuine unease into her voice. Not fabricated, just the real unease of the last 36 hours surfaced slightly and allowed to show. "I've been inside that estate for 2 days and I'm starting to understand that what I was told about this arrangement and what's actually happening are not exactly the same thing." Caruso was very still. He's not what I expected," she said. "He's been more open than I anticipated, which is making me wonder what he's being open about in order to keep me from looking at something else." She held Caruso's gaze with the expression of a woman who is frightened and trying not to show it, and not quite succeeding. "You put this arrangement together. You suggested it. I want to know why." She watched the calculation run in his eyes. She watched him decide that she was exactly what she appeared to be. A civilian out of her depth, coming to the fixer because the principle had become too complicated, and she watched him conclude that she was manageable. "I suggested it," he said carefully, "because it solved a specific legal problem." "The acquisition record." "Yes. And now that I'm there, now that the acquisition record is being documented, what happens next? To me, specifically." He looked at her with the particular compassion of a man who has none but has learned to perform it convincingly. "That depends on how useful you continue to be." "To Dante," she said. A pause. "To the situation." She let that sit. She let him watch her process it with the slightly slow, slightly overwhelmed processing of a woman who is only now beginning to understand the actual shape of what she's in. She let him feel the advantage of knowing more than her. "The property," she said. "My father's property. The deed Dante gave him. That's real? That holds?" "As long as the arrangement holds," Caruso said. "And if it doesn't?" "Nothing in this world is unconditional, Ms. Bennett." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a difficult truth. Then she looked up at him and said, "The offshore entity, the one above you." She said it quietly, matter-of-factly, watching his face. "When they called me this morning, do they know I'm here talking to you?" The quality of the silence changed entirely. Caruso's stillness became a different kind of stillness. The stillness of a man who has just realized the person across from him is not where he thought she was. She watched him run back through the last 4 minutes, recalibrating every exchange. And she watched him arrive at the conclusion that he'd been played. And she watched him decide what to do about it, and she did not look away from his eyes for any of it. "They called you," he said. There wasn't a question. "This morning, 4 hours ago." She looked at him steadily. "They gave me 6 hours to transfer the Bennett vineyard to a third-party entity. They said the federal filing goes forward automatically if I don't comply." She paused. "They said you were a contractor, that you'd been a contractor since the beginning and that the operation you thought you were running was theirs, not yours, and that when it concluded you'd be as exposed as Dante Romano." She held his gaze. "Was that true?" Caruso looked at her for a long time. The performance of compassion was entirely gone. What was left was a man doing the math on a situation that was reordering itself faster than he could manage. "Where is Romano right now?" he said. "His estate," she said. "Meeting with his brother." She let that land. "He doesn't know I'm here." Another silence. "You came alone," Caruso said. "I came to understand my options," she said, "before the 6 hours are up, before I make a decision that I can't take back." She leaned forward slightly. "You built the documentation structure. You know every layer of it, which means you know whether there's a version of this that doesn't end with both of us buried under it." She held his gaze. "Is there?" She watched him make the decision. She watched it happen in real time. The specific moment when a man who has operated as other people's instrument for long enough looks at the instrument being turned against him and decides that self-preservation is the only architecture he actually believes in. He opened the laptop. "What I'm about to show you," he said, "stays in this room until I have guarantees." "What kind of guarantees?" "Immunity," he said. "Federal, full." She thought of Elena's AUSA contact. She thought of Romano in the estate right now, sitting across from his brother in a conference room, performing normalcy over an abyss. She thought of 3 hours and 11 minutes. "I can get you a conversation," she said. "Today, with someone who has the authority to negotiate that. But I need what you have first." "That's not how guarantees work." "No," she said, "but it's how trust works. And right now, Mr. Caruso, I am the only person in your immediate situation who is not actively trying to use you as a fall guy." She held his gaze. "So, show me what you have." He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned the laptop to face her. The screen showed a financial architecture that was the most complex thing she'd seen in 36 hours of complex things. Layered entities, offshore structures, transfer chains spanning 4 countries, all of it annotated in Caruso's own hand with the thoroughness of a man who had documented everything because documentation was how he'd always protected himself. At the center of it, visible now for the first time with a name attached to it, was the originating entity. She read the name. She read it twice. She looked up at Caruso. "That's not possible," she said. "And yet," he said. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady. She photographed the screen. 3 images, overlapping, covering every section of the architecture. And then she looked at the name again and felt something cold and final move through her understanding because the name on that screen was not the anonymous offshore voice she'd been constructing in her mind, not a nameless entity, not an abstract financial structure. It was a person she'd heard of, a person Romano had heard of, a person whose public profile was so far removed from what she was looking at on this screen that the distance between the 2 versions, was itself the most sophisticated concealment she could imagine. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus?" "Outside." "We have a problem." Then it buzzed again. "Nico left the estate 20 minutes ago. He's not at the meeting." She was already standing. "Mr. Caruso," she said, "I need you to close that laptop and come with me right now." "I told you I need guarantees before." "Nico Romano just left his brother's estate, and he's mobile and he knows we're moving," she said. "Which means in approximately 40 minutes, he either reaches his trigger mechanism or he reaches you. And the entity above him," she pointed at the laptop, "they already know this conversation is happening because they've had this office monitored since you became useful to them." She looked at him directly. "You have two options. You come with me now, or you sit here and wait to find out which one of those two things reaches you first." Caruso stared at her. Then he closed the laptop and stood up. They were down the stairs and through the side entrance in 90 seconds. Marcus had the car running. She got Caruso into the back seat and herself in after him, and Marcus pulled out before the door was fully closed. She called Elena. "We have Caruso," she said. "He has the full architecture and he's willing to talk." "Where is your contact?" "Federal building downtown," Elena said. "She's been waiting since I called. Isla..." A pause. Nico's phone just pinged a cell tower 6 blocks from Crown Street. She looked out the window. The street behind them was clear. "How far are we from the federal building?" she asked Marcus. 11 minutes. "Drive like 10, she said. She looked at Caruso beside her in the back seat. He was sweating, his hands clasped in his lap, and he had the look of a man who has spent his career operating in the spaces between loyalties and has finally run out of space. "The name on that screen," she said. "How long have they been planning this?" "Longer than Romano has been running the organization," Caruso said. "They were planning this before his father died." He looked at her. The father was the original target. Dante was collateral. The intention was always to acquire the Romano organization's assets and the Valley mineral rights simultaneously, using the same legal mechanism. He paused. Dante Romano was supposed to be in prison 2 years ago. What delayed it? Caruso looked at her with something that was either guilt or something that had lived next to guilt so long it had taken on its shape. "He was harder to move than they calculated," he said. "Smarter, more careful. Every mechanism they built, he found a way around it without knowing that's what he was doing." A pause. "And then he made the marriage offer, and I told them, and they..." He stopped. "They saw it as the delivery mechanism," she said. "Yes." She looked out the front window at the federal building coming into view. The gray face of it, the flags, the steps. She thought about a man who had been harder to move than calculated. She thought about 36 hours of a person she was still assembling, piece by piece, into someone she understood. She thought about his hand on hers in the library, brief and present, and then gone. Marcus pulled up to the federal building. She got out and turned to help Caruso and looked up and stopped. Nico Romano was standing at the top of the steps. He was alone. He was looking directly at her. He had his phone in his hand and his thumb was on the screen, and she understood with absolute and immediate clarity what he was looking at and what he was about to do. She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them was 40 feet in a staircase and everything that had happened in the last 36 hours. "Don't," she said. Her voice carried. It was quiet, and it carried, and he heard it. He looked at her for a long moment with his thumb on the screen, and in his face she could see the same architecture she'd seen in Dante's Mafia, the same bone structure, the same angular precision, assembled into something entirely different by the choices he'd made with it, and she looked at him and she did not look away. "It's already over," she said. "Caruso is here. The documentation is with Elena's contact. The physician's letter is already in federal hands." She held his gaze across the 40 feet. "The only question left is what version of this you want to be part of." Nico Romano looked at her. Then he looked past her at Caruso, standing by the car, not meeting his eyes. Then he looked at the phone in his hand. She held her breath. He looked back at her, and his face was doing something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not calculation, but something raw and more complicated, The face of a man standing at the edge of a structure he'd spent years building, looking down and understanding for the first time what it actually cost to build it. His thumb moved. She lunged forward, 3 steps, fast, her hand out. But she was too far and she knew it before she'd taken the second step, and she watched his thumb complete the motion and braced for the sound of something ending. Nothing happened. Nico stared at his phone. He pressed it again. Then again, with the specific escalating pressure of a man whose certainty is converting to panic, one failed attempt at a time. She stopped on the steps below him. "It's already been deactivated," she said. She was breathing hard. "Elena's contact froze the filing channel 40 minutes ago. The trigger has nowhere to go." The phone dropped to his side. He looked at her. Up close, the resemblance to Dante was even harder. The same dark eyes. But where Dante's held a contained depth that she'd spent 2 days learning to read, Nico's held something that had been eating itself from the inside for a very long time. "You had 40 minutes, he said. His voice was hollow. "You've been here 40 minutes. "I've been moving for 4 hours, she said. "You were watching the wrong door." He sat down on the steps, not dramatically, just sat down the way a person sits when their legs have made the decision for them. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the ground, and she stood 2 steps below him and breathed and let her heart rate come down from the place it had gone. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. Behind her, she heard the federal building's glass doors open and Elena's voice, and another voice she didn't recognize. The AUSA, she assumed, efficient and immediate. She looked at Nico Romano sitting on the steps of a federal building with his phone in his hands, and the architecture of 3 years dissolved around him. She said, "Did you know about your father?" He went very still. "Did you know what they were going to do to him?" she said. "Or did they do it without telling you, and you found out after, and decided the outcome was acceptable?" The stillness lasted a long time. "I found out after," he said, very quiet. 6 months after. "And you kept going." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus and nodded once, and Marcus moved forward, and she turned and walked up the remaining steps and through the glass doors and into the building's cold, fluorescent interior, where Elena was standing with a woman in a dark suit who was already reaching for the documents in Elena's hands. She stopped in the lobby and pressed her back against the wall beside the door and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Her hands were shaking. Finally, now that it was over, now that the sustained urgency that had held her together for 4 hours had released her, her hands were shaking, and she let them, and she breathed, and she thought about Romano in the estate right now, waiting for a call that was already 40 minutes late. She pulled out her phone. He answered on the first ring. "It's done," she said. "Nico is outside. Caruso is here. The filing is frozen." She paused. "Come to the federal building." A silence, brief and full. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at her shaking hands. She thought about what the next hours would require. The statements, the documentation review, the beginning of the legal process that would dismantle everything he'd built and everything that had been built against him simultaneously. She thought about the valley and her father's land and a name on a laptop screen she hadn't told him yet. She thought about everything still ahead of them. "Yes," she said. "Come." Romano arrived at the federal building 43 minutes after she called. She watched him come up the steps from the lobby window. The long coat, the controlled stride, the way he scanned the exterior before entering out of habit so ingrained it had stopped being conscious. He passed Nico on the steps without stopping, without looking down. And she watched that too. Watched the single moment when his peripheral vision registered his brother sitting there and the way his body absorbed it without breaking stride. And she understood that whatever that cost him, he had decided to pay it somewhere between the estate and this building and had arrived already on the other side of it. He came through the glass doors and found her immediately. He looked at her hands. They'd stopped shaking 20 minutes ago, but he looked at them anyway, and she let him, and then he looked at her face. "You're all right," he said. Not a question this time. "Yes." He nodded. He looked around the lobby, Elena at the far end with the AUSA, Marcus near the door, Caruso in a side room with 2 federal agents and a court reporter who'd arrived with impressive speed. He took in the architecture of what she'd built in 4 hours, and she watched him take it in and watch something move through him that was too large and too complicated to name simply. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. The name on Caruso's screen, the originating entity. She held his gaze. "It's Harrison Vole." The name registered. She watched it register, the specific quality of recognition that comes not from surprise, but from the terrible confirmation of something suspected and never proven. His jaw tightened once and then released. Harrison Vole, 73 years old, former senator, current chairman of the Vole Capital Group, publicly celebrated as one of the architects of legitimate private equity reform in the Northeastern Corridor, privately the most patient and untraceable financial predator in the region. A man whose public profile was constructed with the same precision that other men constructed fortresses. A man who had been Romano's father's business partner for 6 years before the Romano family had quietly and irrevocably severed the relationship. "He was there at the beginning," Romano said. "Before the beginning," she said. "Caruso has documentation going back 19 years. Vole and your father built 3 joint ventures together. When your father ended the partnership, Vole spent the next 11 years building the mechanism to take everything back." She paused. "He wasn't after the Valley. He was never primarily after the Valley. He was after the Romano organization itself, the operational infrastructure, the networks, the territory. The Valley was the legal instrument. Your father's death was the opening move." She looked at him steadily. "And you were the target the entire time." Romano was very still. "He's 80 minutes from this building," she said. "He has a property in Westport. The AUSA has enough with what Caruso provided to move on him today, but she wants your cooperation on the organizational records to make the case unassailable." She paused. "It means opening everything." "I know what it means," he said. "Your entire operation, the structure, the territories, the financial records going back to when you took over, the legitimate and the—" She stopped. "The rest," he said. "Yes." He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something enormous for a long time and has just set it down and is standing in the strange lightness of its absence, not entirely sure yet what to do with his own hands. "Where's the AUSA?" he said. She took him to her. The next 6 hours were the most procedurally complex of Isla's life, and she had managed a failing vineyard's finances through 3 simultaneous creditor disputes, so the bar was not low. The AUSA, whose name was Catherine Marsh, who was 47, and had the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had been building toward this specific day for 14 months and was not going to waste it on imprecision, moved through Romano's cooperation deposition with the methodical thoroughness of a surgeon, and Romano answered every question with a directness that Isla suspected was both genuine and the most strategically sound thing he could do, and she sat in the corner of the deposition room and listened and took notes and did not let herself think about anything beyond the immediate procedural requirements of the next question. Caruso's deposition ran parallel in the adjacent room. Elena managed it, which was the right call. She knew the material, she knew Caruso's patterns, and she had the particular credibility of someone who had been inside the operation long enough to verify what he said in real time. At 4 in the afternoon, federal agents arrived at Harrison Vole's Westport property. Isla wasn't there for it. She heard about it from Catherine Marsh 40 minutes later, Marsh coming into the deposition room with the contained, professional version of satisfaction on her face, the version that career prosecutors allow themselves when something they've worked toward for over a year actually happens the way it was supposed to. "He was home," Marsh said. "He didn't run. He had lawyers there within 20 minutes, which tells you how long he's had them on standby." She looked at Romano. "He's going to fight this." "He'll fight it for years," Romano said. "Yes," Marsh said, "but the documentation Caruso provided is comprehensive enough that fighting is the only option he has. Winning is a different question." She paused. "The mineral rights case collapses with the fraudulent acquisition chain exposed. The federal filing against your organization is voided by prosecutorial conflict. It was built on compromised evidence submitted through a channel Vole's entity had corrupted." She looked at Romano steadily. "Your cooperation today doesn't erase 8 years of organizational activity." You understand that? I understand that, he said. There will be a process. Charges that can be brought will be brought. You'll have representation, and the cooperation agreement will be considered in sentencing determinations. She held his gaze. But you're not going to prison for Harrison Voll's crimes. That much I can tell you now. Romano nodded. A single nod, slow and final. Marsh left. Romano looked at the table in front of him. The cleared surface where 6 hours of documentation had been spread and collected and signed and witnessed, and he sat with whatever he was sitting with, and Isla watched him from across the room and gave him the silence. After a moment he said, "My father would have done the same thing." She looked at him. "Cooperated," he said. "Opened everything. He believed that what the family had built should be built on something that could survive the light." He looked at his hands. "I spent 8 years telling myself I was honoring what he built. I think I was just afraid to look at it the way he would have." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. He looked up at her. "The vineyard?" "Still your father's," she said. "The deed holds." "The Kellerman acquisition holds. The 3 properties you were moving on this morning are in process." She paused. "The corridor is yours, legitimately, however you want to use it. Sell it," he said. "Fair market, open process. The mineral rights go to a public trust." He looked at her. "That's what my father would have done with it." She absorbed that. "What about the other property owners in the valley?" she said. "The ones Caruso pressured over the years? The ones who sold under circumstances that—" "I know," he said. "I know what was done." He was quiet for a moment. "There are attorneys who specialize in fraudulent acquisition recovery. I'll fund the process." He said it simply, without theater. "Every family, whatever it takes." She looked at him for a moment. This man she'd known for 2 days, who had torn up $400,000 and asked her to marry him in her father's farmhouse, and had turned out to be simultaneously more honest and more complicated than either of those actions had suggested, and who was sitting here now in the aftermath of the worst 2 days of his life, making quiet decisions about restitution with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who has decided what kind of person he intends to be and is simply being it. She said, "I need to call my father." "Use the room," he said. "I'll be in the lobby." He left. She called Thomas Bennett. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been near the phone, which meant he'd been waiting. She could hear it in the quality of his hello, the tightness of someone who has spent 8 hours trying not to imagine outcomes. "It's over," she said. "The deed is secure. The property is yours." She paused. "There's going to be legal process for the next few months. You may be asked to give a statement about the original loan arrangement, but your land is yours." A silence on his end, long enough that she began to speak again and stopped when she heard the sound he was making, which was very quiet and which she had not heard from him since her mother's funeral 14 years ago. She waited. "Are you safe?" he said finally. "Yes." "Are you—" He stopped. She could hear him composing himself on the other end of the line, the specific, effortful composure of a man who has been afraid for his daughter for 48 hours and is only now being told he can stop. "Are you coming home?" She looked at the deposition room around her, the empty table, the window with the late afternoon light going amber through it. "Not tonight," she said. "Soon." Another pause, then carefully. "The man." "Yes." "Is he—" He stopped again. She knew what he was trying to ask. He was her father, and he was trying to ask if she was all right in the way that went beyond the physical, in the way that a father asks when what he really needs to know is whether the thing he set in motion when he signed a loan he didn't understand 4 years ago has done irreparable damage to the person he loves most. "He's not what I expected," she said. "He's something else." Her father was quiet for a moment, then, "The East Slope irrigation. I checked the coupling this morning, like you said." She almost laughed. It came up in her chest, and she pressed it down into something that was just warmth, just the specific warmth of a thing that is ordinary and real and still intact despite everything. "Good," she said. "Was it the fitting?" "Fitting and the line itself, Old line. I'll need to replace the whole run before the dry stretch. I know, she said. I've been thinking about that for 2 years. Come home when you can, he said. I will. She ended the call and sat alone in the deposition room for a few minutes. She was very tired. The kind of tired that lives below the physical, in the layer that effort and adrenaline can't reach, the layer that only rest and time and the genuine cessation of urgency can address. She sat with it and let herself be tired without doing anything about it. Then she stood up and went to find Romano. He was in the lobby, as he'd said, standing at the window, which she was beginning to understand was his default position. The window, the grounds, the outside. A man who had spent his adult life inside closed rooms making decisions and who still looked instinctively toward the open. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside the federal building, the evening was coming in, the long summer dusk of the northeastern coast, the sky going layers of amber and gray, the street below still moving with the ordinary traffic of people who had spent this day doing ordinary things and would go home tonight to ordinary lives. Unaware that 40 feet above the sidewalk, 2 people were standing at a window in the aftermath of something that had rearranged the shape of both of their futures. Nico, she said. In federal custody, he said. He didn't resist. A pause. He asked if I was, He asked through one of Marcia's people if I was all right. She said nothing. I don't know what to do with that, Romano said. Flat. Honest. You don't have to know tonight, she said. He looked at her. When do I have to know? I don't think there's a deadline on that one. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite the corner of mouth flicker she'd catalogued over the last 2 days, but something slower and more deliberate than that. A decision made visible. The marriage, he said. She waited. The legal justification for it is gone, he said. The acquisition record doesn't need protecting anymore. Caruso's documentation supersedes everything. He looked at her directly. You don't have to stay. She looked at him. The 41-year-old man who had walked into her father's farmhouse 2 days ago with 3 men behind him and the quiet certainty of someone who had never been told no, and who had torn up a contract and asked an impossible question and had spent the subsequent 48 hours being, against every expectation she'd had walking into his car that morning, genuinely and without performance exactly who he'd presented himself as. I know I don't have to, she said. He held her gaze. The East Wing has a private entrance, she said, and my own key. It does. That was day 1, she said. You gave me that on day 1. Yes. Why? She'd been carrying the question since the first morning. Not the legal rationale, not the acquisition record. Why specifically a private entrance and my own key on the first morning? He looked at her for a moment, then he said, Because I needed you to know that you could leave, that the door was yours. A pause. If you stayed, I needed it to be because you chose to, not because the door was locked. The lobby was quiet around them. Elena was somewhere in the building still. She could hear voices down a corridor. Outside, the traffic moved. The sky was going deeper amber now, almost gold. She thought about 42 acres of vineyard in the Crestwood Valley and the East Slope irrigation and the old trellises and a deed with a notary seal that was real. She thought about a man she'd been prepared to hate and had instead spent 2 days finding, piece by piece, to be something more difficult and more interesting than hate. She thought about what her life looked like from this lobby, in this light, with the urgency finally gone, the actual shape of it, the actual question of it, which was not what she was running from, but what she was choosing toward. The estate has 40 staff, she said. 32 after today's events, he said. Some of them will need to be replaced. I'd want to be involved in who's brought in. He looked at her. That's a reasonable request. And the legitimate business transition, the organizational restructuring that's going to take the next 2 years to execute properly. You're going to need someone who understands both the legal framework and the operational reality. She held his gaze. I ran a 42-acre business through 3 creditors, a bank refusal, and a 4-year debt crisis. I understand operational reality. Yes, he said, Something was happening in his face that was different from anything she'd cataloged. Quieter than the calculation, warmer than the assessment, more careful than either. "You do?" "Then I'll stay," she said. "Not because of the legal rationale, not because of the vineyard or my father or any of the things that got me into your car 2 days ago." She looked at him directly. "Because I want to." The amber light through the federal building's lobby window was the last of the day's sun, going fast now, and it caught the side of Romano's face at an angle that made him look, briefly, like the version of himself that might have existed if the last 8 years had been different. Younger, less worn, more of the person he'd been before his father's death, had handed him a world he'd spent every year since trying to hold together. He said, "Isla." "Yes." I've been alone in that house for 8 years." He said it without apology, without performance. Just the fact of it, stated. "I'm not certain I know how to do this." "I'm not certain either," she said. "I've been managing someone else's crisis for so long, I'm not sure I know what it looks like when it's mine." She paused. "We have that in common." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Not a gesture she'd expected. Simple, direct, very human. She looked at it. The scraped knuckles from a morning that felt like a week ago, the steadiness of it. She took it. His hand closed around hers and she felt the warmth of it, and the steadiness of it, and the very particular quality of a grip that is not holding someone in place, but simply holding on. And they stood there at the window while the last of the amber light left the sky outside, and the lobby lights came up around them, and the city beyond the glass moved in its ordinary evening rhythms, entirely indifferent to the two people standing at the window deciding, without a contract or a debt or a gun to either of their heads, to move toward each other. 3 months later, the Crestwood Valley looked like it always had in early autumn. The vine leaves going gold and amber on the slopes, the morning air carrying the first real cold of the coming season, the sky that particular clear blue that comes after the summer heat finally breaks. Thomas Bennett was on the east slope when Isla arrived, checking the new irrigation line, and he turned when he heard the car on the gravel and stood watching her walk across the field toward him with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who is doing a thing he'd been afraid he might never do again, standing on his own land in the morning light without fear. She walked up the slope and stood beside him and looked at the vines. "New fittings held through the dry stretch," he said. "Good. The harvest will be light this year. Too much ground stress from the summer." He looked at the vines with the assessing eye of 40 years. "Next year will be better." "It usually is," she said. He looked at her, at the things he could see in her face that hadn't been there 6 months ago, the tiredness that had settled into something more like substance, the particular look of a person who has been through something real and has come out the other side, not unscathed, but not broken either. He looked at her the way fathers look at daughters they have failed and been failed by, and loved without interruption throughout, and she looked back at him with the same uncomplicated truth. "He's coming next week," she said, "if that's still all right." "It's your home," her father said. "It's always all right." "It's your home," she corrected. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can he tell the difference between a sick vine and a stressed one?" "Probably not." "Then we'll teach him." He turned back to the slope. "There's coffee in the house." She stayed on the slope a few minutes longer after he went in, looking at the valley below. The full sweep of it in the morning light, the other properties visible in the middle distance, the Kellerman land to the north, the old marsh property at the western end. The valley that had been the object of 19 years of patience and calculation by a man who had believed that anything could be owned if you waited long enough and built carefully enough in the dark. Harrison Voll's trial was scheduled to begin in 4 months. Catherine Marsh had described the case against him as the most thoroughly documented financial conspiracy she'd seen in 22 years of federal prosecution. The proceedings would take years. The outcome, Marsh had said, was as certain as these things ever were. The valley would remain the valley. The mineral rights were in the process of transferring to the public trust Romano had established. The corridor would be accessed eventually, and the revenue would go to the Regional Infrastructure Fund and the Family Restitution Program that Romano's attorneys were administering, and the names of the families who had lost property to manufactured pressure over 2 decades would be recorded in a legal settlement document that would outlast everyone involved. Not justice, exactly. Isla had stopped expecting justice to look like the word. What it looked like was this: morning light, restored deed, new irrigation fittings, coffee in the house. She took out her phone. Romano answered on the second ring. She could hear in the background the particular quality of silence that meant he was in the estate study. The room she'd found on her first morning, with the map and the annotated surveys and the locked door that had been unlocked. The study was hers now too, in the way that the whole house was hers now too, not because of a legal structure or an arrangement, but because she'd sat at that desk for 3 months and worked and argued and eaten dinner at the table adjacent to it, and fallen asleep once in the chair by the window and woken to find a blanket over her that had not been there when she'd closed her eyes. "How's the slope?" he said. "Better than last year." The new line held. "Your father?" "On the east slope at 6 in the morning, where else would he be?" She looked out over the valley. "He wants to teach you how to tell a sick vine from a stressed one." A pause. "Is that difficult?" "Took me 5 years to learn reliably." "I'll need more than one visit," he said. "Yes," she said, "you will." The morning was very quiet around her. The vines moved slightly in the early air, and the gold light was climbing the slope toward her, and below in the valley the world was waking up at its own pace, unhurried, indifferent to everything that had happened, and everything that was still happening, and everything that would come next. She thought about a farmhouse door opening. 3 shadows in the frame. A man in a charcoal suit who moved through a room like a decision that had already been made. She thought about the specific moment, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, when she had understood that her life was about to change irrevocably and had not yet known in which direction. She thought about the direction it had gone. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "The restructuring attorneys need the second quarter projections by Thursday. Marcus has them. Tell him to send them to me tonight. I want to review them before the Thursday call." "Done." A pause. "Isla." "Yes." A silence that was not empty. The particular quality of a silence between 2 people who have run out of necessary things to say and have arrived at the things that are simply true. "Nothing," he said. "Drive carefully." She smiled at the valley, at the vines going gold, at the morning light on the land her grandfather had built and her father had held and she had nearly lost and had come back to find somehow more fully hers than it had ever been. "I always do," she said. She put the phone in her pocket and stood on the east slope of the Bennett vineyard in the early autumn morning and breathed the cold, clean air of the valley and felt, under the tiredness and the unfinished work and the months still ahead, something she recognized with the particular certainty of something that has been absent long enough that its return is unmistakable. She felt like herself. Not the version of herself that had been managing and containing and holding things together for 10 years. Not the version standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel bracing for the worst. The earlier version, the one underneath all of that. The one who had always known, on some level she hadn't had language for, that she was capable of more than the life that circumstances had constructed around her. The one who had walked out of a car and into a strange house with 3 notebooks and no plan except to understand what she was walking into. The one who had. Thomas Bennett came to the farmhouse door and looked up the slope at her. "Coffee's getting cold," he called. She turned and walked down the slope toward him, through the gold morning light, through her grandfather's vines, across the land that was hers and her father's, and would be her children's if she wanted that, and might be all sorts of things she hadn't imagined yet. And she walked through the farmhouse door that her father held open for her, and into the smell of coffee and the ordinary morning of a life that had not been easy to get to, and was, because of that, entirely, and without reservation, worth having. The door closed behind her. Outside, the valley went on being the valley. The vines went on growing.